Some cities don't just keep secrets. They quietly teach the people who live in them how to hide from themselves. And in this story, beneath the dazzling lights of Los Angeles, you'll discover a world where wealth, freedom, and endless parties slowly give way to emptiness that no one dares to name. Published in 1985, Less Than Zero marked the unforgettable debut of Bret Easton Ellis. Inspired by his own observations of privileged youth and the emotional detachment surrounding him while growing up in Los Angeles, he transformed those experiences into a haunting portrait of a generation drifting without direction. The novel became an international success, selling millions of copies worldwide and establishing Ellis as one of the defining voices of contemporary American fiction. He would later deepen his reputation with works like American Psycho and The Rules of Attraction, both of which further explored the unsettling corners of modern life. The story found its way to the screen in 1987 with a film adaptation, though its haunting atmosphere and themes have continued to spark discussion long after the credits rolled. What you'll hear is a carefully crafted third-person retelling, not a word-for-word reading of the original novel. And as you listen, the visuals in this video are created using today's technology. They may not always perfectly match every scene from the story, but they are designed to help you visualize the world and atmosphere as you listen. As you follow these characters into a world where appearances are everything and feelings are almost forbidden, you'll also uncover fascinating facts about the novel, its creation, its adaptation, and the hidden details that make its legacy so enduring. The story begins. The car glided up the on-ramp, and the first thing he registered, the first thing that would lodge itself in his skull for hours, was her muttered observation about Los Angeles drivers and their fear of merging. He was 18, it was December, and the flight had been rough. The Santa Barbara couple across from him in first class had gotten thoroughly drunk. His jeans were still cold and loose from the mud that had splattered them at the New Hampshire airport that morning. The wrinkled, damp shirt he wore had looked fresh only hours ago. A tear on the neck of his gray argyle vest now seemed distinctly Eastern, out of place next to her clean, tight jeans and pale blue t-shirt. None of it mattered next to those 10 words. They were easier to absorb than the possibility that Muriel might be anorexic, easier than the singer on the radio crooning about magnetic waves, even the warm winds pushing the car down the empty asphalt, even the faint, faded smell of marijuana still clinging to the interior. All of it dissolved against the single fact he was a boy coming home for a month, meeting someone he hadn't seen in 4 months, and people were afraid to merge. She pulled off the freeway, stopped at a red light. A heavy gust rocked the car and she smiled, mentioning something about putting the top up before switching radio stations. Approaching his house, she had to brake again. 5 workmen were hauling the remains of fallen palm trees into a big red truck. She smiled again. The gate was open. He stepped out, surprised by the dry, searing heat. He stood there for a long moment, and after she helped him lift the suitcases from the trunk, she asked what was wrong. He told her nothing. She said he looked pale. He shrugged. They said goodbye, and she drove away. The house was empty. Air conditioning hummed, and the place smelled of pine. A note on the kitchen table told him his mother and sisters were out Christmas shopping. Through the window, he could see the dog asleep by the pool, breathing heavily, its fur ruffled by the wind. He climbed the stairs, past the new maid, who smiled with recognition, past his sister's rooms unchanged, except for different GQ cutouts on the walls, and entered his own room. White walls, records in place, television untouched, Venetian blinds open just as he'd left them. Someone, his mother or the new maid, had cleaned out his closet. A pile of comic books sat on his desk with a note asking if he still wanted them. A message from Julian, a card that said, "Fuck Christmas" on the outside, and inside, an invitation to Blair's Christmas party. Let's fuck Christmas together. He set the card down and noticed the room growing cold. He took off his shoes, lay on the bed, pressed a hand to his forehead. Fever, he thought. He looked up cautiously at the glass-encased poster on the wall above him, the old Elvis Costello promotional image. Elvis stared past him with that wry, ironic smile, the word trust hovering above his head. His sunglasses, one red lens, one blue, were pushed down just enough to reveal eyes that looked slightly off-center. They didn't look at him. They only looked at whoever stood by the window. He was too tired to get up and stand there. He called Julian. Amazed, he still remembered the number. No answer. Through the blinds, he watched palm trees bend and shake wildly in the hot winds. He looked back at the poster, then away, then back again, the mocking smile, the mismatched glasses. The sentence about merging was still there, stuck in his head. He tried to blank it out. He turned on MTV, told himself he could get over it and fall asleep if he had some Valium. He thought about Muriel, and felt a little sick as the videos began to flicker past. That night, he brought Daniel to Blair's party. Daniel wore sunglasses, a black wool jacket, black jeans, and black suede gloves to hide the thin silver wires still protruding from the wound on his thumb and fingers, a cut from a week earlier in New Hampshire. He'd watched them clean and sew the wound in the emergency room until he felt sick and had retreated to the waiting room at 5 a.m, hearing the Eagles sing New Kid in Town, and had wanted to come back. Now, at Blair's door in Beverly Hills, Daniel complained that the gloves stuck to the wires and were too tight, but he refused to take them off. Blair answered, exuberant, in a black leather jacket and matching pants, barefoot. She hugged him, then looked at Daniel, grinning, asking who this was. He introduced them. She offered her hand, and Daniel smiled, shook it softly. She welcomed them in with a Merry Christmas. 2 Christmas trees stood in the living room and den, twinkling dark red. People from high school, most unseen since graduation, gathered around them. Trent, a male model he knew, was there, a red and green plaid scarf around his neck. Greetings were exchanged. Introductions made. Trent asked Daniel where he went to school. Daniel said with him. Trent said UCLA, joking about what Orientals called it, parodying an old Japanese man with a drunken laugh. Blair chimed in about the University of Spoiled Children, USC, and then Trent and Blair traded jokes about Jew SC and Jew CLA, laughing together until she broke off, brushing past him toward the door, suggesting he try the punch. Daniel offered to get it, asked Trent if he wanted some. Trent declined, then told him he looked pale. He noticed it was true compared to Trent's deep tan and the complexions of most people in the room. He'd been in New Hampshire for 4 months. Trent reached into his pocket, handed him a card for a tanning salon on Santa Monica, not artificial lighting, not vitamin E capsules, but an uva bath that actually dyed the skin. He stopped listening after a while, looking instead at 3 tan blonde boys he didn't know, friends of Blair's from USC, one singing along with the music. Trent explained again what worked. He looked at the card, confirmed they dye your skin. Trent said okay. A pause. Trent asked what he'd been doing. He said unpacking, and asked the same back. Trent's smile turned proud as he announced his acceptance by a top modeling agency. In 2 months, he'd be on the cover of International Mail, and also appear as the month of June in UCLA's College Man calendar. He was clearly the one, he confirmed. When questioned about the magazine, he assured he didn't like it. His agent had negotiated no nude shots, only Speedos, and the like. He didn't do nude stuff. The narrator believed him without quite knowing why, and scanned the room for Rip, his dealer. Not seeing him, he turned back and asked what else Trent had been doing. The usual Nautilus, getting drunk, the Uva place, but Trent quickly became anxious, extracting a promise not to tell anyone about the tanning salon. The narrator squeezed his shoulder in reassurance. Then Trent excused himself with a wink and a joke about business, lunch later. Daniel returned with a punch deep red, potent. The narrator coughed after a swallow. Across the room, he could see Blair's father, a movie producer, in the den corner with a young actor he vaguely recognized from school. Jared, the father's young boyfriend, blonde, tan, blue-eyed, with immaculate white teeth, was chatting with the 3 USC boys. Blair's mother sat by the bar, hands trembling as she brought a vodka gimlet to her lips. Alana appeared, hugging him, and he introduced her to Daniel. She told Daniel he looked like David Bowie, and asked if he was left-handed. He wasn't. The narrator explained Alana's preferences: left-handed, Bowie-looking, colony-dwelling. She called him a beastie, a total beastie, and Daniel agreed. He suggested she try the punch. She announced she'd made it, then spotted Jared and abruptly shifted, wishing Blair's father wouldn't invite him, as it made her mother nervous. Blair's mother was agoraphobic, she explained, and Jared was headed to Death Valley on location anyway. Why couldn't he wait? Daniel and the narrator agreed solemnly. She noticed his pallor and suggested the beach. He fingered Trent's card and asked about Julian. The message, the inability to reach him. Alana's expression darkened. Julian was completely messed up, she'd heard. He asked what she meant. The 3 USC boys and Jared laughed loudly in unison. Alana rolled her eyes, explaining Jared had heard a crude joke from his boyfriend at Morton, something about the 2 biggest lies being promises to pay back and not to finish orally. She didn't even get it. She had to help Blair. The mother was heading behind the bar. She excused herself. Daniel joked about humming a Bowie song. The narrator agreed he should have. Daniel repeated the beastie line. They left after Trent and one of the USC boys toppled into the Christmas tree. Later, at the Polo Lounge's darkened bar, not much was said. Daniel quietly admitted he wanted to go back. Asked where, he paused long enough to unsettle, then said he didn't know. Just back. At a Melrose restaurant, his mother, still in sunglasses, drank white wine and kept touching her hair. He stared at his shaking hands. She asked what he wanted for Christmas. He said nothing. He asked the same of her. She paused, then said she just wanted a nice Christmas. He was silent. She told him he looked unhappy. He denied it. She repeated it, softer. He returned the observation, hoping she'd stop. She didn't speak again until her 3rd glass was empty and she'd poured a 4th. She asked about the party. He said okay. 40, 50 people, he guessed. She asked what time he'd left. He couldn't remember. 1, maybe 2. Must have been 1. Another pause, another swallow. He admitted it hadn't been very good. She asked why. He just said it wasn't. In a yellow train car on Sunset, Trent smoked and drank a Pepsi while the narrator stared out at passing headlights. They were waiting for Julian to bring Trent a gram. Julian was 15 minutes late. Trent grew nervous and impatient. The narrator suggested dealing with Rip instead. Trent shrugged. They left. Tried the Westwood Arcade. Found nothing. Fat burger next. Trent was hungry. Fasting, apparently. They ordered. The narrator wasn't hungry. Trent noticed the lack of chili on his burger, incredulous. The narrator rolled his eyes and lit a cigarette. Trent muttered about him being weird. Too long in New Hampshire. The narrator stayed quiet, noticing the bright, painful yellow walls glowing under fluorescent lights. Joan Jett played Crimson and Clover. He stared at the walls, thirsty but unwilling to approach the counter, the sad-faced Japanese girl, the security guard eyeing everyone. Trent still stared at the burger. A guy in a red shirt in the next booth pretended to play guitar, mouthing the song's words. At 2 a.m, hot at the Edge's back room, Trent tried on his sunglasses. He wanted to leave. Trent said soon. The dance floor music was too loud, and he tensed with each song transition. Leaning against a brick wall, he noticed 2 boys embracing in a dark corner. Trent asked if he wanted a Quaalude. Pulling out a Pez dispenser, Daffy Duck's head tilted back. He just stared. Trent put it away, craned his neck, asked if that was Muriel. No. He said that girl's black. Trent agreed. A pause. It wasn't a girl. He wondered how Trent could mistake a black teenage boy in a dress for Muriel. He repeated that he had to leave. Trent said they all had to leave. He stared at his shoes. Trent said he was too much. He kept staring, tempted to ask for the Pez. Trent suddenly urged them to find Blair and leave. He didn't want to go back to the main room but knew he had to. He spotted Daniel with a pretty tan girl in a cut-off heaven shirt and black and white miniskirt. He whispered they were leaving. Daniel gave him a look and told him not to give him any shit. He yanked Daniel's arm. Said he was drunk. Daniel agreed. He kissed the girl's cheek and followed toward the door, where Blair stood talking to a USC guy. She asked if they were leaving. He said yeah. wondering where she'd been. They stepped into the hot night, and she asked if they'd had a good time. No one answered. She looked down. Trent and Daniel stood by the BMW Trent pulled Cliff Notes for as I lay dying from the glove compartment and handed them to her. Goodbyes were said, and they made sure Daniel could get into his car. Trent briefly suggested one of them drive Daniel home, but quickly dismissed it too much hassle to drive him back tomorrow. He drove Blair to her Beverly Hills house. She fingered the Cliff Notes silently until she tried to rub the black stamp off her hand, frustrated that it never came off. Then she mentioned that even though he'd been gone 4 months, he'd never called. He apologized, turned off the too bright Hollywood Boulevard, took Sunset, then her street, then her driveway. They kissed. She noticed his white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, pointed out his red hands, and got out. The late morning and early afternoon had been spent shopping in Beverly Hills with his mother and 2 sisters. His mother had likely been at Neiman Marcus. His sisters had gone to Jerry Magnin on their father's charge account to buy gifts, then to MGA, Camp Beverly Hills, and Privilege for themselves. He'd sat at the La Scala boutique bar, bored, smoking, drinking red wine. Finally, his mother pulled up in her Mercedes and waited. He left money on the counter, got in, and leaned his head against the headrest. In the back seat, his sisters chattered. One was going out with a Harvard 9th grader, a year above her. Their mother mentioned hearing the house was for sale. The older sister muttered about whether the boy himself was for sale, and they giggled. A truck carrying video games passed by, sending them into a frenzy. They demanded to follow it, and asked if their father would buy them Galaga for Christmas. That their mother asked what it was a video game. She pointed out they had Atari, but that was deemed cheap. She mentioned she was having dinner with him that night. The older sister found that encouraging. They argued about where to put the game. His room, their mother suggested. He shook his head. They protested that he always locked his door, which pissed them off. They demanded to know why. He didn't answer, even when they pressed again. He considered throwing their shopping bags out the window. Finally, under pressure from his mother, he turned and told them because they'd stolen a 1/4 gram of cocaine from him the last time he left the door open. They fell silent. A song called Teenage Enema Nurses in Bondage came on. His mother asked if they had to listen, but his sisters demanded it louder. No one spoke until it ended. At home by the pool, his younger sister called bullshit she could get her own cocaine. The psychiatrist he saw during his 4 weeks back was young, bearded, drove a 450 SL, owned a house in Malibu. In the Westwood office, shades drawn, he'd sit with sunglasses on, smoking cigarettes close sometimes, just to irritate. Sometimes he cried, sometimes they yelled at each other. He'd confess bizarre sexual fantasies, and the psychiatrist's interest would perk up. He'd laugh for no reason, then feel sick. He sometimes lied. The psychiatrist told him about his mistress and repairs on his Tahoe house. He'd close his eyes, light another cigarette, grit his teeth. Sometimes he just got up and left. At Dupar's in Studio City, he waited for Blair, Alana, and Kim. He'd missed the movie Valium-induced sleep and agreed to meet them here. He sat in a booth near a large window, asked the waitress for coffee, but she never brought it, already wiping other tables and taking orders. That was fine, his hands were shaking badly. He lit a cigarette and studied the Christmas display above the counter, a neon-lit Santa with a styrofoam candy cane, large green and red boxes leaning against it empty. Probably, his eyes locked with a small, dark, intense man in a Universal Studios t-shirt 2 booths across, staring at him. He looked down, took a deep drag. The man kept staring. He thought either the man didn't see him or he wasn't there. The merging sentence came back. Wonder if he's for sale. Suddenly, Blair kissed his cheek and sat down with Alana and Kim. She rushed to tell him Muriel had been hospitalized for anorexia that day, passed out in film class, taken to Cedars-Sinai, not exactly the closest to USC. She lit a cigarette. Kim, in pink sunglasses, lit one too, and Alana asked for one. They asked if he was coming to Kim's party. He asked when, knowing Kim's weekly parties. She said near the end of next week, probably tomorrow. Alana suddenly panicked about who to go with. She'd thought Cliff, but Kim was going with him. Alana said she'd go with Warren. But Kim thought Blair was going out with Warren. Blair corrected that she had just slept with him, not gone out. Alana asked if Kim had slept with Warren. No, but she thought Cliff was sleeping with Warren. Blair thought Cliff was sleeping with Didi Hellman. Alana denied it. Blair said Didi had told her. Kim and Alana hadn't heard it. He realized he might have slept with both Didi and Warren, but said nothing. The conversation spiraled around who slept with whom. He remained silent as they debated. Alana echoed that she hadn't heard it either, but Blair insisted Didi had told her. Alana dismissed Didi's credibility based on her Calabasas address. Blair reasoned that, if Cliff had slept with Didi, he must have slept with Raoul. Alana and Kim asked who Raoul was. He opened his menu, pretending to read, the name stirring a faint familiarity, wondering if he'd slept with him too. Blair explained, Raoul was Didi's other boyfriend, always involved in ridiculous threesomes. Didi was ridiculous, Alana agreed. Kim asked if Raoul was black. Yes, she thought she'd met him at a Roxy backstage party. She'd thought he'd OD'd, but Blair corrected that, no, he was really cute, the best-looking black guy she'd ever seen. Alana and Kim nodded. He closed his menu. Kim asked if he was gay. Blair clarified he was bi, though hesitantly. Alana doubted he'd actually slept with Didi. Blair agreed. Then why go out with him? Because she thought it was chic to have a black boyfriend, Blair said, bored. Alana called her a sleaze. They fell silent. Then Kim expressed surprise that Cliff slept with Raoul. Alana rolled her eyes, saying Cliff had slept with everyone. Kim and Blair laughed. Blair looked at him, and he tried to smile. The waitress took their order. As he'd predicted, Kim's party was that night. He followed Trent there. Trent arrived wearing a tie and insisted he wear one, so he put on a red one. But when they stopped at Santo Pietro's to eat beforehand, Trent caught his reflection, grimaced, and took his off, telling him to do the same, which was fine since no one at the party wore one anyway. At the Holmby Hills house he chatted with many people who told him about Fred Siegel's suit shopping and concert tickets. He heard Trent boasting about his UCLA fraternity. He talked to Pierce, an old high school friend, apologizing for not calling since his return. Pierce said it didn't matter, remarked on his pallor, and mentioned his new BMW graduation gift had been stolen. Julian was there, not as messed up as Alana had suggested, still tan and blonde, perhaps too thin but otherwise presentable. Julian apologized to Trent for missing him at Carney's and said he'd been busy. Standing next to Trent, who just finished his third gin and tonic, he heard Trent call that really fucking irresponsible. He turned away, wondering if he should ask Julian about the message he'd left. But when their eyes met, Julian looked away and walked into the living room. Blair danced over, singing, "Do you really want to hurt me?" clearly stoned, telling him he looked happy and good. She handed him a Jerry Magnan box and whispered, "Merry Christmas, you fox," kissing him. He opened it a scarf. He thanked her and said it was nice. She insisted he put it on. He noted scarves fit everyone, but she insisted. He put it on, she murmured, "Perfect," and went to the bar. He stood alone in the living room corner with a scarf around his neck and spotted Rip, his dealer, feeling relieved. Rip wore a thick white parachute-style outfit and an expensive black fedora. Trent, as Rip approached, joked about parachuting. Rip stared him down until he stopped. Julian re-entered, and he was about to go over when Rip grabbed his scarf and pulled him into an empty room. He noticed the lack of furniture and asked why. Kim was moving, Rip said, and then accused him of not returning his phone call. He knew Rip hadn't called, but apologized anyway, saying he'd only been back 4 days and had been looking for him. Rip asked what he had. He asked what Rip had. Rip asked what he'd taken up there, pulling out 2 small envelopes. He listed his course as art, writing, music. Rip feigned excitement about the music course, asked if he'd written any. "A little," he said, reaching for his wallet. Rip joked about lyrics and millions. He asked millions of what? Rip asked if he was going back. He didn't answer, staring at the half-gram poured onto a mirror. Rip laughed, asked if he was staying in L.A., lit a cigarette, cut the pile into 4 lines with a razor, and handed him a roll 20. He leaned down and did a line, then asked where school. Rip said he supposed so. Rip did both his lines. He did the other. Rip commented on the scarf, that Blair still liked him. He guessed. He asked for a gram. Rip handed him an envelope. He paid 2 50s and a 20, but Rip returned the 20 as a Christmas present. He thanked him. Rip advised him to go back, not to fuck off or be a bum. He said like you, and regretted it. Rip said like me. He admitted he didn't know if he wanted to, that things weren't that different there. Rip seemed restless, indifferent to his decision, pointed out he had a month to think about it. He agreed. He asked if Rip was still DJing. No, Rip said. The trust was holding steady. He might go back if it ever ran out, but it probably wouldn't. He had a penthouse on Wilshire. He was invited to stop by. Rip sat on the windowsill, speculated that Alana wanted to fuck him, and asked what he thought. He didn't understand why Rip wasn't Bowie like left-handed or colony dwelling, but he shrugged and said sure, why not? Rip hopped off the windowsill, insisting he had to come over to the apartment, a bootleg Temple of Doom that cost $400. He agreed, sure, and they walked to the door. Rip pressed him to confirm. He said, why not? Back in the living room, 2 girls he didn't remember approached, telling him to call them. One reminded him of a night at the Roxy. He said there'd been a lot of nights at the Roxy. She smiled and told him to call anyway. He wasn't sure he had her number, and was about to ask when Alana interrupted, complaining that Rip had been bothering her. Could he do anything? He said he didn't think so. As she talked, he watched Rip's roommate dancing with Blair by the Christmas tree, whispering something that made them both laugh and nod. An older man graying long hair, Giorgio Armani sweater, moccasins, wandered past and started talking to Rip. One of the USC boys from Blair's party made a face at the old man, then at one of the girls who'd approached him. The boy noticed him watching and smiled. He smiled back. Alana kept talking until Prince came on loudly, and she left to dance. The USC guy Griffin came over and offered champagne. He said sure, and Griffin went to the bar. He looked for a bathroom to do another line. He had to go through Kim's room since the downstairs lock was broken. As he reached her door, Trent came out and closed it, telling him to use the one downstairs. Why? Because Julian, Kim, and Durf were fucking in there. He just stood there, surprised Durf was present. Trent told him to come. He followed downstairs out of the house to the BMW. Trent got in and pulled out a small vial of Coke with a gold spoon, doing 4 hits. He handed it over. He did 4 hits too, eyes watering. Swallowing it wasn't as good as Rip's, and he wondered if Trent got it from Julian. Trent suggested Palm Springs for a week while he was back. He said sure, then said he was going back inside. He left Trent alone and returned to the party, finding Griffin at the bar with 2 glasses of champagne. Griffin warned it was a little flat. He said that was okay, and drank it. Griffin poured another. They repeated, Griffin refilling both. Griffin's day had left with Kim's hairdresser, a Japanese guy in an English beat t-shirt and tight white pants. He finished the glass, looking across the room at Blair. Their eyes met. She smiled and made a face. He smiled back but didn't make one. Griffin noticed and asked if he was the guy going out with Blair. Used to, he said. Griffin thought he still was. Maybe they were, he said, pouring more champagne. Griffin said she talked about him a lot. His voice trailed off. They fell silent. Griffin liked his scarf. He thanked him, drained the glass, poured another, wondering what time it was and how long he'd been there, the Coke fading, drunkenness setting in. Griffin suggested going to his house. His parents were in Rome for Christmas. He finished his glass quickly and said sure, why not? In Griffin's bedroom, Griffin stood by the window in just jockey shorts, looking out at the pool. He sat on the floor back against the bed, bored and sober, smoking. Griffin slowly, clumsily pulled off his underwear. He noticed no tan line and almost laughed. He woke before dawn, mouth dry, tongue stuck. He tried to sleep again, but the digital clock read 4:30, and he fully realized where he was. He got out carefully, went to the bathroom, stared at himself nude in the mirror, splashed cold water on his face, stared longer, Back in the bedroom, he put on his underwear, making sure they weren't Griffin's, then panicked when he couldn't find his clothes. Remembering they'd started in the living room, he crept downstairs through the empty mansion and dressed quickly. As he pulled up his pants, a black maid in a blue robe and curlers passed by, glancing at him casually, unfazed. He found the front door with difficulty and left, telling himself it hadn't been that bad. In the car, he opened the glove compartment and cut a line to get home, then drove past the gates onto Sunset. He turned the radio up, drove fast through empty streets. At a red light, he was tempted to run it, but stopped when he noticed a billboard he didn't remember disappear here. Probably an ad for some resort, but it freaked him out. He hit the gas hard, screeching away. He put on sunglasses despite the darkness and kept checking the rear view, feeling someone was following him. At another red light, he realized he'd left Blair's scarf at Griffin's. His Mulholland house. He pressed the gate opener, looked out over the valley at the beginning of another day. His fifth back then pulled into the circular driveway, parking next to his mother's car, beside an unfamiliar Ferrari. He sat through the last lines of a song, then went inside. He locked his bedroom door, lit a cigarette, turned on the TV with the sound off. In the closet, he found the Valium hidden beneath cashmere sweaters. He looked at the small yellow pill with the hole in the middle, decided he didn't need it, and put it away. He undressed, checked the digital clock same as Griffin's, and realized he had only a few hours to sleep before meeting his father for lunch. He set the alarm, lay back, and stared hard at the television, remembering that if you stared long enough, you could fall asleep. The alarm jolted him at 11. A song called Artificial Insemination played on the radio. He waited until it finished before opening his eyes. Sunlight flooded through the Venetian blinds, and his reflection in the mirror showed a wild, cracked grin. In the closet, he examined his face and body, flexed, considered a haircut, decided he needed a tan. He opened the envelope hidden beneath the sweaters, cut 2 lines of the coke from Rip, did them, and felt better. Still in his jockey shorts, he walked downstairs. At 11, no one seemed awake. His mother's door was closed, probably locked. He went outside, dove into the pool, did 20 quick laps, then toweled dry as he walked through the kitchen. He took an orange from the refrigerator, peeled it walking upstairs, ate it before showering. No time for waits. In his room, he turned on MTV loud, cut another line, and drove to meet his father for lunch. He hated Wilshire during lunch hour. Too many cars, old people, maids at bus stops. He'd look away, smoke too much, turn the radio up. Nothing moved despite green lights. Waiting, he studied drivers in adjacent cars, trying to make eye contact. When it didn't happen, and it usually didn't, he'd put his sunglasses back on and creep forward. Pulling onto Sunset, he passed the Disappear Here billboard and looked away, trying to shake it. His father's Century City offices. He waited, in the large, expensively furnished reception room, flirting with a pretty blonde secretary. His father left him waiting 30 minutes, then asked why he was late. He didn't care. He'd rather be at the beach or sleeping, but he was nice, smiled, nodded, listened to questions about college, and answered sincerely. He wasn't embarrassed when his father put the 450s top down and played Bob Seger on the way to Ma Maison, a strange gesture of communication. At lunch, his father talked to many film industry businessmen who stopped by. He was introduced only as, "my son," and they all blurred together. He wished he'd brought more Coke. His father looked healthy. If you didn't look too long completely tan, with a recent hair transplant and facelift. He'd visited him at Cedar Sinai after the procedure, remembered the bandages and his father touching them lightly. After they ordered, he asked why his father wasn't having the usual. His father smiled, showing caps, and said his nutritionist wouldn't allow it. His father asked about his mother. He said she was fine. Was she really? Yes. He was tempted to mention the Ferrari in the driveway but didn't. His father asked if she was still seeing Dr. Crane. Yes. That's good. Another businessman stopped by, left. His father asked what he wanted for Christmas. Nothing. Did he want his variety subscription renewed? It already was. Did he need money? No. He knew his father would slip him some later. His father said he looked thin and pale. He mumbled it was the drugs. His father didn't quite hear. He said he'd gained 5 pounds since coming home. His father poured wine. Another business guy dropped by, left. His father asked if he wanted to go to Palm Springs for Christmas. He remembered skipping school at the end of senior year, driving alone to Palm Springs with old tapes, stopping for a Coke in Sunland. He parked in front of the old house, not the new one the family had bought. The old house was empty. Scummy, unkempt weeds, a fallen TV aerial, empty trash cans on the dead lawn. The pool was drained. Memories rushed back. Friday nights driving in, Sunday nights leaving, afternoons playing cards on chaise longues with his grandmother. But those memories faded against the empty beer cans, smashed windows. His aunt had tried to sell but got sentimental. His father wanted it sold and was bitter no one had. They stopped talking about it. The house, an unspoken rift between them. He hadn't gone to look around or skip school. He went to remember the way things were. He didn't know why. After lunch, he visited Muriel at Cedar Sinai. Blair said she wanted to see him. She was pale and thin, veins visible in her neck, dark circles under her eyes, pink lipstick clashing with her pallor. She watched an exercise show, surrounded by magazines, curtains closed. She asked him to open them. She put on sunglasses, said she was having a nicotine fit and dying for a cigarette. He had none. She shrugged, turned up the volume, laughed at the exercises. Neither said much. Leaving the parking lot, he made wrong turns, ended up on Santa Monica. He sighed, turned up the radio. Little girl singing about an L.A. earthquake. At a light, a Fiat pulled up with 2 young guys, short hair, bushy mustaches, plaid shirts, ski vests. One looked at him with surprise and disbelief, told his friend something. The driver rolled down his window, asked something, but his own window was up, and top wasn't down. He didn't answer. The driver asked again, convinced he was a certain actor. The light turned green. He drove off, but traffic was bad, and at the next red light, the Fiat was beside him again. The 2 guys were laughing, pointing, asking the same question repeatedly. He made an illegal left turn, parked on a side street, turned off the radio, lit a cigarette. Rip was supposed to meet him at Cafe Casino in Westwood but hadn't shown. There was nothing to do, too hot to walk, and he'd seen all the movies, some twice. He sat under the umbrellas, drinking Perrier and grapefruit juice, watching cars roll by in the heat. He lit a cigarette and stared at the Perrier bottle. 2 girls, 16 or 17 with short hair, sat at the next table. He kept looking over. They flirted back. One peeled an orange, the other sipped espresso. They discussed hair colors, maroon, anthracite, but the espresso drinker vetoed both, suggesting red or violet instead. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked back at the bottle. She paused and asked what anthracite was. A black Porsche with tinted windows pulled up. Julian got out, spotted him, and approached reluctantly. They exchanged greetings. Julian asked what was going on, how long he'd been back. 5 days, he said. He was waiting for Rep. Julian looked exhausted and weak, but he told him he looked great. Julian returned the compliment, adding he needed a tan. Julian apologized for missing him at Carney's, and for freaking at the party. He'd been strung out 4 days, forgot, hadn't even been home. He slapped his forehead, worrying about his mother. He was sick of dealing with people. He looked past him, uncertain. He glanced at the Porsche, trying to see through the tinted windows, wondering if someone else was inside. Julian fiddled with his keys and offered help if he needed anything. He declined, then expressed concern they should get together. He'd missed him. Julian looked away, said he'd been all right, asked where he'd been. Vermont? New Hampshire. How was it? Okay. Julian had dropped out of USC, couldn't deal, maybe next year. Had he talked to Trent? If he wanted to see him, he would. Another pause. He asked what Julian had been doing. Julian mentioned a Tom Petty concert at the Forum. He sang that song they used to listen to, struggling to remember, then humming and singing a line about straight into darkness. The girls looked over. He felt embarrassed, said he remembered. Julian loved that song. He agreed. Julian had been hanging out, no good. He reminded Julian about the message he'd left. Julian dismissed it, said, forget it. he pressed. Julian refused. Julian took off his sunglasses, squinted with blank eyes. He asked how the concert was. Julian started biting his nails, then said it was a bummer. He walked away with a later. He said later back, looking at the Porsche, feeling certain someone else was inside. Rip never showed. He called around 3, telling him to come to the Wilshire apartment. Spin. Rip's roommate was sunbathing nude on the balcony. Devo played. Rip was still in bed, nude, cutting coke on a mirror. He invited him in, told him to check the view. He walked to the window. Rip offered coke. He declined. A very young tan guy, 15 or 16, came out of the bathroom, zipping his jeans, sat on the bed, put on oversized boots. Short spiked blonde hair, Fear t-shirt, black leather bracelet. Rip ignored him. He pretended the kid wasn't there. The kid stared at Rip and left. Spin walked naked into the kitchen, squeezed grapefruits, asked Rip about reservations with Cliff at Morton's. Rip confirmed. He wondered why Rip had called him over instead of meeting elsewhere. He stared at an old framed Beach Boys poster over the bed, trying to remember which one died, while Rip did 3 more lines, then threw his head back, shook it, sniffed loudly. Rip asked what he was doing at the Westwood Cafe Casino when he'd clearly said Beverly Hills. He was pretty sure Rip said Westwood. Rip said no, then dismissed it. He pulled out his wallet, feeling that Rip had never shown it at either location. Trent was on the phone in his room, trying to score coke from a Malibu dealer since he couldn't reach Julian. 20 minutes later, he hung up, frustrated. He suggested a movie. 9 new films opened Friday. Trent sighed, answered the phone again. The new dealer, but the call wasn't good. He mentioned seeing a 4 o'clock show. Trent suggested he go with Daniel or Rip or one of his faggot friends. He said Daniel wasn't a faggot. Trent said everyone thought he was like Blair. He insisted Daniel wasn't. Trent told him to try telling Blair that. He said he wasn't going out with Blair anymore. It was over, trying to sound steady. Trent didn't think she agreed. He asked why Trent cared. Maybe he didn't, Trent sighed. Trent changed the subject to a party for a new group at the Roxy. He didn't know who was giving it or which group. He mentioned Daniel's party that night. Trent scoffed at a fag party. The phone rang again. He said, "Screw you." Trent grabbed it, screamed he didn't want the coke, then said he'd be right down. It was his mother calling from downstairs. They walked downstairs. The maid sat dazed in the living room, watching MTV. Trent explained she didn't like cleaning when anyone was home, was always stoned anyway. His mother felt guilty since her family was killed in El Salvador, but he figured she'd be fired eventually. Trent approached her. She looked up nervously and smiled. He tried Spanish but couldn't communicate. She just nodded blankly. He declared her stoned again. In the kitchen, his mother smoked and finished a tab before heading to a Century City fashion show. Trent poured orange juice, offered him some, but he declined. He looked at his mother, took a swallow. Silence stretched for nearly 2 minutes, until she said goodbye. Trent didn't respond, just asked if he wanted to go to the Roxy that night. He said no, wondering what his mother had wanted. Trent pressed. He said he was going to Daniel's party. Great, Trent said flatly. He was about to ask about a movie when the phone rang upstairs and Trent ran to answer. He returned to the living room, watched Trent's mother drive off. The maid stood, walked slowly to the bathroom. He heard laughing, retching, laughing again. Trent came back looking pissed, sat in front of the TV. The call hadn't gone well. He mentioned the maid seemed sick. Trent asked if she was freaking out again. He guessed so. Trent said his mother would fire her soon enough, took a swallow of orange juice, stared at MTV. He stared out the window. Trent finally said he didn't want to do anything. He decided he didn't want to see a movie either, wondered who to bring to Daniel's party. Maybe Blair. Trent suggested watching Alien. That would freak her out completely. He decided to bring Blair. He drove to her Beverly Hills house. She wore a pink hat, blue miniskirt, yellow gloves and sunglasses, telling him someone at Fred Siegel had said she should be in a band she mentioned starting something new. Wave. He smiled, said that sounded good, unsure if she was sarcastic, and gripped the steering wheel tighter. At Daniel's party he hardly knew anyone. He found Daniel sitting drunk and alone by the pool in black jeans, a white Specials t-shirt, and sunglasses. He sat down while Blair got drinks. Daniel finally spoke slowly, greeting him. He responded. Daniel asked if he was having a good time. He just arrived. Daniel asked who he came with Blair getting drinks. He thought she believed they were lovers. Daniel nodded without smiling. He put his sunglasses back on. Daniel turned to the pool. He asked where Daniel's parents were. In Japan. Shopping, maybe Aspen, did it matter? Blair returned with a gin and tonic and a beer, handed him the beer, lit a cigarette, warned him not to talk to the guy in the blue and red polo shirt, a narc, and asked if her sunglasses were crooked. He said no. She smiled, put a gloved hand on his leg, whispered she didn't know anyone, and wanted to leave now. She glanced at Daniel, asked if he was alive. He didn't know. Daniel turned, greeted Blair. He told Daniel they were leaving, excited by her whisper and the gloved hand. Daniel asked why. He stumbled for an answer. Daniel said they'd just arrived. He insisted they had to go. Daniel told him to stick around, tried to lift himself but couldn't. He asked why. Daniel paused, then said just to be here. He said Blair wasn't feeling well. Daniel had wanted him to meet Carlton and Cecil, but their limo broke down. He apologized, said they'd have lunch. Blair nodded and coughed. He said maybe he'd drop by later, feeling guilty. Daniel said no, he wouldn't. Blair grew anxious, not wanting to argue all night, finished her drink. He said goodbye. Daniel said he'd call tomorrow, suggested lunch. He agreed without enthusiasm. In the car, Blair urged him to go somewhere. Hurry. He thought she should just say it. He asked where. She named a club. He lied about his wallet. She had a pass. Knowing he lied, he really didn't want to. She turned up the radio and hummed. He considered driving to her house but kept going, unsure. They stopped at a Beverly Hills coffee shop. Afterwards, he asked where she wanted to go. She said, her house. He lay in Blair's bed, stuffed animals everywhere. He rolled over, felt something hard and furry under him, a stuffed black cat. He dropped it, got up, showered, toweled dry, wrapped the towel around his waist, and dressed. Blair smoked, watching MTV with the sound down. She asked if he'd call before Christmas. Maybe, he said, pulling on his vest, wondering why he'd come. She asked if he still had her number, reaching for a pad. He said yes, he'd get in touch. He buttoned his jeans, turned to leave. She called his name. He stopped. She said if she didn't see him before Christmas, have a good one. He returned the sentiment. She stroked the stuffed black cat. He stepped out, started to close the door. She whispered loudly. He stopped but didn't turn. She said nothing. The rain had stayed away too long, and Blair kept calling, suggesting they escape to the beach club. He was usually too drained or fogged to manage the drive, let alone sit under an umbrella in the midday glare, so they decided on Monterey instead. The cooler coast, where the water shimmered green, and his parents kept a house at Pajaro Dunes. They took his car, claimed the master bedroom, and drove into the small town for supplies, food, cigarettes, candles. There wasn't much to see: a paint-peeling movie theater, gulls, rotting docks, Mexican fishermen who whistled at Blair, and a church she photographed from the outside but never entered. In the garage, they stumbled across a case of champagne and polished it off over the week, usually opening a bottle late morning after their beach walks. Early mornings. They made love sometimes in the living room, sometimes on the master bedroom floor, closing the blinds and lighting the candles they'd bought, watching their shadows stretch and contract across the white walls. The house was old and faded, with a courtyard and tennis court they never used. Instead, he roamed at night, spinning old records he used to love, sitting in the courtyard with the last of the champagne. He didn't much like the place. Something about the white walls, the thin blinds, the black kitchen tile made him restless, and he'd sometimes escape to the deck at night. From there, he'd walk the damp sand, smoke, and look back at the lit house, spotting Blair's silhouette through the window, phone pressed to her ear, talking to someone in Palm Springs. When he came back inside, they'd be drunk enough for her to suggest swimming, but the water was too cold, the dark too thick. They'd settle instead into the small jacuzzi in the courtyard, making love there. Days blurred into a rhythm of him reading the Chronicle in the living room while she combed the shore for shells. They stayed up until nearly dawn and didn't stir until mid-afternoon, then opened another bottle. One day they took the convertible to a secluded stretch of beach, bringing caviar. She had chopped onions, eggs, and cheese along with fruit, cinnamon cookies she favored, and a 6-pack of tab, her only drink besides champagne. They jogged the empty shore, or fought the rough surf. But soon he felt unmoored. Aware he'd drunk too much whenever she spoke, he found himself shutting his eyes, exhaling. The water grew colder and more violent, the sand wet and heavy, and she'd sit alone on the deck scanning the afternoon fog for boats. Through the glass, he watched her play solitaire, hearing the boats groan and creak, and she'd refill her champagne glass, a sight that unsettled him more than he could name. When the champagne ran dry, he turned to the liquor cabinet. They both tanned, but by week's end they'd retreated to television, poor reception, and all drinking bourbon while she arranged her shells in circular patterns across the living room floor. One night, sitting on opposite sides of the room, she murmured that they should have gone to Palm Springs instead. He knew then it was time to leave. He drove alone afterward, threading through Wilshire, Santa Monica, Sunset, then Beverly Glen to Mulholland, and Sepulveda to Ventura, pushing through Sherman Oaks, Encino, Tarzana, Woodland Hills. At an all-night Sambo's, he took a large empty booth, as the wind picked up, rattling the windows hard enough that their trembling, about to shatter, filled the air. 2 young men in black suits and sunglasses sat nearby. One wore a Billy Idol pin, and drummed the table with a shaking hand that kept missing the beat. When the waitress brought their check, the pinned one snatched it, challenging her addition. She hesitated, offered a nervous defense, and he sneered back. His companion cut it off with a muttered dismissal. He hated the valley, and tossed a 10 on the table. Rising, the other one belched, and sneered something loud enough for her to hear about Valleyites spending their money at the Galleria before they stepped out into the wind. When she reached his table, still shaken, she muttered something about pill poppers and added that other places outside the valley weren't all that great. At a newsstand on the way home, he bought a porn magazine with 2 girls holding riding crops on the cover. He stood still in the quiet, empty streets, hearing only papers rustling as the vendor weighed down stacks with bricks. Coyotes howled, dogs barked, and the hill's palm trees thrashed in the gusts. The wind rocked his car before he drove back up into the hills. Later, from his bed, the whole house rattled, and he lay awake, convinced the windows would crack and shatter. He sat up, staring out. Then at the Elvis poster, the eyes looking past the window into the night, the face almost alarmed, the word trust suspended above it. His mind drifted to the billboard on Sunset, to Julian's distant gaze at Cafe Casino. He finally fell asleep on Christmas Eve. Daniel called the day before Christmas, sounding better. Someone had fed him a bad loot at his party, he said. He'd also gotten a vague letter from Vanden, a girl from their school in New Hampshire, who might be pregnant, might be starting a punk band in New York, might be living with a drummer, might or might not come to L.A., might or might not carry his child, might or might not abort it. Her parents had divorced her mother, had moved back to Connecticut. The letter was unclear. Clay, listening from his bed with MTV flickering, told him not to worry, and asked about his parents' return. Daniel said they'd be gone 2 more weeks. He planned to spend Christmas with friends in Bel Air, having scrapped plans with a girl in Malibu who had mono. When Daniel wondered whether to contact Vanden, Clay felt the weight of urging him to try, surprised by the effort it cost, but Daniel saw no point. They wished each other Merry Christmas and hung up. At Chasen's on Christmas Eve, late nearly 10, he sat with his parents and sisters, pushing his fork across the plate, tracing paths between peas. His father poured more champagne. His sisters, tan and bored, talked of anorexic friends and a Calvin Klein model, looking older than he remembered, especially as they sipped slowly from their stems. They told jokes he didn't follow, and recited their Christmas wishes to their father. They'd picked his father up earlier at his Century City penthouse, the one he'd moved into after the separation about a year ago. He'd already opened a bottle and finished most of it. The penthouse was large and nicely decorated, with a jacuzzi outside the bedroom that ran warm and steaming. His parents, who'd barely exchanged words since the split, sat across from each other in the living room, visibly straying by the holiday's forced proximity. They'd spoken maybe 4 words total, his father asking about her car, her confirming yes, his father saying fine. That was all. His father drained his glass and poured another. His mother asked for bread. His father wiped his mouth, cleared his throat, and Clay tensed, bracing for the inevitable question about Christmas wishes, even though his sisters had already made theirs clear. His father opened his mouth. Clay shut his eyes. The question, when it came, was about dessert. An anticlimax that left him almost dizzy. The waiter appeared. He declined. He kept his gaze off his parents, running a hand through his hair, craving something Coke, anything to get through the evening. He scanned the half-empty restaurant, hearing whispers carry across the room, and it distilled to this: an 18-year-old with shaking hands, blonde hair, the start of a tan, semi-stoned, sitting at Chasen's on Doheny and Beverly, waiting for his father to ask what he wanted for Christmas. Conversation stayed thin and meaningless, and no one seemed to mind, least of all him. His father brought up a business associate who died of pancreatic cancer. His mother mentioned a tennis partner who'd had a mastectomy. His father ordered another bottle, 3rd, 4th, and shifted to a new deal. His older sister yawned, picked at her salad. His mind drifted Blair alone in her bed, stroking that stupid black cat, the billboard reading, "Disappear here." Julian's eyes, the question of whether he was for sale, people afraid to merge the pool at night, its lit water glowing in the backyard. Jared walked in, not with Blair's father, but with a famous model who kept her fur coat on, and Jared kept his dark glasses on. A man from Warner Brothers, an acquaintance of his father's, came over to wish them Merry Christmas. Clay didn't listen. He watched his mother stare into her glass. One of his sisters told her a joke she didn't get, and she ordered a drink. He wondered if Blair's father knew Jared was here tonight with this model. He hoped he'd never have to do this again. They left Chasen's onto empty streets, the air still dry and hot, the wind still blowing. On Little Santa Monica, a car lay overturned with broken windows. His sisters craned their necks, asking his mother to slow down, but she didn't, and they complained. At Jimmy's they pulled up. The valet took the Mercedes, and they settled on a couch by a small table in the dark bar. The place was nearly empty, scattered couples, one other family across the room. A piano player softly sang September Song. His father complained. It should have been Christmas carols. His sisters went to the restroom and returned with news of a lizard in a stall his mother didn't understand. He found himself flirting with the oldest girl from the other family, wondering if his own family looked similar from the outside. She had short blonde hair, blue eyes. A tan reminded him of someone he'd seen briefly in New Hampshire. When she caught him staring, she looked away, smiling. His father requested a phone, a long cord brought to the couch, and called his own father in Palm Springs. They all wished him a Merry Christmas. Clay felt foolish, saying it in front of that girl. On the drive home after dropping his father at the Century City penthouse, he pressed his face to the car window, watching the valley's lights drift up toward the hills as they climbed Mulholland. One of his sisters had put on their mother's fur coat and fallen asleep. The gate opened. The car pulled in. His mother pressed the button to close it. He tried to wish her a Merry Christmas, but the words wouldn't come, so he left her sitting in the car. Christmas in Palm Springs, always hot. Even when it rained, it was still hot. Last Christmas, after the old house had been abandoned, the heat was beyond what anyone could remember. The Security National Bank in Rancho Mirage read 111, 112, 113, and he stared at the numbers, refusing to believe it could get that hellish. But then he'd look across the desert, feel the hot wind whip his face, see the sun glare so hard that his sunglasses couldn't block it, and he'd squint to see the metal grids and crosswalk signs twisting, writhing, actually melting in the heat. He knew he had to believe it. Nights weren't any better. At 7 it was still light. The sky stayed orange until 8 hot winds came through canyons and filtered over the desert. When real darkness fell, the nights were black and hot, with strange white clouds drifting slowly across the sky, gone by dawn, and quiet. Driving down 111 at 1 or 2 in the morning was strange. No cars, and if he stopped, turned off the radio, rolled down the windows, he could hear nothing but his own breath. Raspy, dry, uneven. He wouldn't stay stopped long because catching his own red, scared eyes in the rear-view mirror frightened him, and he'd drive home quickly. Early evenings were the only time he went outside. He'd sit by the pool in the shade, eating banana popsicles and reading the Herald Examiner, the water mostly still except for occasional ripples from huge yellow and black bees and black dragonflies crashing in, driven mad by the heat. Last Christmas in Palm Springs, he'd lie naked in bed with the air conditioner on, cool air blowing over him, a bowl of ice some wrapped in a towel beside him, yet he couldn't get cool. Visions of driving through town, hot wind on his shoulder, heat rising from the desert, made him feel warm, so he'd force himself up, walk downstairs to the deck by the lit pool in the middle of the night, and try to smoke a joint, barely able to breathe. He'd smoke it anyway, just to sleep. He could only stay outside so long. Strange sounds and lights came from next door, and he'd go back upstairs, lock his door and finally sleep. When he woke in the afternoon and came downstairs, his grandfather told him he'd heard strange things at night. Clay asked what, but his grandfather couldn't say. Must be his imagination. Probably nothing. The dog barked all night when Clay woke to quiet it. The dog looked freaked out, wide eyes, panting, shaking, but Clay never went outside to see why. He'd lock himself back in his room, press the damp, cool towel over his eyes. The next day, by the pool, he found an empty package of Lucky Strikes. No one in the family smoked. The next day, his father had new locks put on all doors and back gates, while his mother and sisters took down the Christmas tree, all while Clay slept. A couple hours later, Blair called. She mentioned a photo of her and her father and the new people at a premiere. She was drunk, alone in the house, her family down the street at a screening room, watching a rough cut of her father's new film. She said she was nude in bed and missed him. He paced the room, nervous, then stared at himself in the closet mirror. He spotted a small shoebox in the corner and looked through it while she talked photos of them at prom, at Disneyland on grad night, at the beach in Monterey, at a party in Palm Springs, a picture of Blair and Westwood he'd taken when they'd left school early, her initials on the back. He also found a shot of himself, jeans, no shirt, no shoes, lying on the floor in sunglasses, hair wet. He couldn't remember who took it. He smoothed it out, tried to look at himself, thought about it more, then put it away. There were other photos he couldn't face, old snapshots of Blair and him, so he closed the shoebox back in the closet. He lit a cigarette, turned on MTV, muted the sound. An hour passed. Blair kept talking, insisting she still liked him, that they should get back together, that 4 months apart was no reason to break up. He pointed out they'd been together, mentioned the previous night. She said he knew what she meant. He began to dread sitting in the room, listening to her. He glanced at the clock, almost 3. He admitted he couldn't remember what their relationship had been like, and tried to steer the conversation toward movies, concerts, what she'd done all day, what he'd been doing tonight. When he finally got off the phone, it was nearly dawn on Christmas Day. Christmas morning found him wired on coke, as one of his sisters handed over an expensive leather-bound datebook, thick white pages, with dates elegantly printed in gold and silver. He thanked her, kissed her, played along, and she smiled, pouring herself more champagne. He'd tried keeping a datebook one summer, but it never worked. He'd get confused, scribble entries just to fill space, eventually realizing he didn't do enough to warrant one. This new one would likely go back to New Hampshire with him, sit on his desk for months, blank and unused. His mother watched from the couch edge, sipping champagne. His sisters opened their gifts with casual indifference. His father, neat and hard, wrote out checks for them all. Why he couldn't have done it before was a passing thought, quickly forgotten as Clay looked out the window at the hot wind tearing through the yard, rippling the pool water. On a warm, sunny Friday after Christmas, he decided he needed to work on his tan. He went to the beach club with Blair, Alana, Kim, Rip, and Griffin. He arrived first, sitting on a bench while the attendant parked his car, staring out at the expanse of sand meeting the water, the edge where land ended. Disappear here. He watched the ocean until Griffin pulled up in his Porsche, chatting with the attendant. Rip arrived in his new Mercedes, also seeming to know the attendant. When Clay introduced them, they laughed and said they already knew each other, and he wondered if they'd slept together, the thought making him dizzy enough to sit back down. Alana, Kim, and Blair arrived in a convertible Cadillac. Blair mentioned they'd just had lunch at the country club. With Kim getting lost, Kim denied it, and they'd stopped at a gas station where Kim asked the attendant for his phone number. Blair shrieked that he was just a gas pumper. His name Moose Kim didn't care, insisting he was gorgeous. On the beach, Griffin had smuggled rum and coke, and they finished it. Rip practically stripped to expose his tan line. Clay didn't apply enough oil to his legs or chest. Alana played the same XIII song repeatedly on her portable tape deck. Talk drifted to the new Psychedelic Furs album. Blair mentioned Muriel had just been released from Cedars-Sinai. Alana said she'd called Julian to invite him, but no one answered. Eventually, everyone fell quiet, soaking up the remaining sun. A Blondie song came on, Blair and Kim asking Alana to turn it up. Griffin and Clay headed to the locker room, Deborah Harry asking where her wave was. In the men's room, Griffin studied himself in the mirror, asking what was wrong. Clay said he was just tense, splashing water on his face. Griffin assured him things would be okay. And back on the beach in the sun, staring at the Pacific, it seemed possible to believe him. But he got sunburned stopping at Gelson's for cigarettes and Perrier. He found a lizard in the front seat. The checkout clerk, talking about murder statistics, asked if he was feeling okay. He didn't answer, just walked quickly out. At home, he showered, turned on the stereo, but couldn't sleep, the sunburn uncomfortable, MTV giving him a headache, so he took some Nembutal Griffin had slipped him in the parking lot. He woke late the next morning to Duran Duran blaring from his mother's room. The door was open. His sisters lay on the big bed in bathing suits, leafing through old GQs, watching a porno on the Betamax with the sound off. He sat on the bed in his own suit, and they told him their mother had gone to lunch, the maid shopping. He watched about 10 minutes of the film, wondering whose it was, his mother's, sister's, a Christmas gift, the Ferrari owner's, his. One sister said she hated when they showed the guy coming. He walked downstairs, out to the pool, and did his laps. He remembered being 15 in Palm Springs, first learning to drive, taking his father's car while his parents slept, cruising the desert at night with his sisters, Fleetwood Mac or Eagles Loud, top down, hot winds bending palm trees. One moonless, windy night after a disappointing party and a closed McDonald's power outage from the winds, his sisters fought in the back seat as he drove home. About a mile away, he spotted what looked like a bonfire. But as he got closer, it was a Toyota parked crookedly, hood open, flames pouring out. The front windshield was smashed. A Mexican woman sat on the curb crying, 2 or 3 children behind her staring at the fire. No other cars stopped or helped. His sisters stopped fighting and urged him to pull over so they could watch. He slowed, then drove on quickly, pushing the tape back in and turning it up loud, running every red light until they reached home. The fire haunted him. He kept imagining a child, not yet dead, lying across the flames, maybe thrown through the windshield onto the engine. He asked his sisters if they'd seen a kid burning. They said no, did he? Neato. He checked the papers the next day to confirm there hadn't been one. Later that night, he sat by the pool thinking about it until he fell asleep, just before the power went out and the pool went black. Around that time, he started collecting clippings. A 12-year-old who shot his brother in Chino, a man in India who nailed his kid to a wall or door, then shot him point-blank, a fire at an elderly home killing 20, a housewife who drove off an embankment near San Diego, killing herself and her 3 kids, a man who calmly ran over his ex-wife near Reno, paralyzing her. He collected a lot because, he guessed, there were a lot to collect. A Saturday night with no parties or concerts, and everyone had seen the movies. People stayed home, invited friends over, talked on the phone. Sometimes someone would drop by, have a drink, then drive to another house, 3 or 4 people making rounds from 10 until dawn. Trent stopped by with a story about hysterical JAPs in Bel Air who'd seen some kind of monster, talk of a werewolf. One of their friends had disappeared. A search party found nothing except a mutilated dog. The JAPs, Trent said, were really out of their heads and had gone to a friend's house in Encino. He figured they'd drunk too much tap, had an allergic reaction. Clay said maybe, but the story unsettled him. After Trent left, he tried calling Julian but no answer. Hanging up, he thought he heard screaming from the house next door down the canyon and closed his window. The dog barked in back. Croc played old Doors songs. Channel 13 had War of the Worlds. He switched to a religious program where a preacher yelled about letting God use you. Lie back and let him use you. Use you, the man chanted. Drinking gin and melted ice in bed. He imagined someone breaking in. Daniel on the phone said it was probably his sisters getting a drink, but it was hard to believe Daniel tonight. The news had reported 4 people beaten to death in the hills. He stayed up most of the night, looking out the window, staring into the backyard, searching for werewolves. At Kim's new house in the hills above Sunset, the gate stood open but the driveway held few cars. Clay and Blair walked up and rang the bell, waiting a long time before Kim answered. Tight faded jeans, high black leather boots, a white t-shirt, a joint in her hand. She took a hit before hugging them both, wishing them a happy new year, then led them into a high-ceilinged entrance room. She'd moved in 3 days ago. She explained her mother was in England with Milo, and they hadn't furnished the place yet. At least the floors were carpeted. She called that a good thing, and he didn't ask why. The house was old, she said, owned previously by a Nazi. On the patios, huge pots held small trees with swastikas painted on them. Nazi pots, she called them. They followed her downstairs to where about 12 or 13 people had gathered. Kim said Fear was supposed to play tonight. She introduced them to Spit, a friend of the drummer's, paler than Muriel, with short greasy hair, a skull earring, and dark circles under his eyes. Spit was angry, telling Kim she had to do something about Muriel, who'd said he looked dead, who said he smelled like a dead animal. He insisted he didn't keep dead animals in his room anymore. Kim dismissed it, saying Muriel was just on lithium 60 milligrams a day and tired her mother had just bought her a $55,000 Porsche. Spit said he couldn't believe it and moved toward the stereo to pick albums. Kim warned him not to bring Muriel down. She'd just left Cedar Sinai and would be fine when she got drunk, just a little strung out. Spit held up an old Oingo Boingo record, asking if he could play it. Kim suggested saving it for later. He gritted his teeth, said he was getting bored. She pulled a joint from her back pocket and handed it over, telling him to cool it. He thanked her and sat on the couch by the fireplace, under a huge American flag replica, staring at the joint a long time before lighting it. Kim complimented them both. Blair returned it. Clay nodded, tired and stoned, not really wanting to be there, but Blair had come over earlier. They'd swum and gone to bed, then Kim had called. When Blair asked if Alana was coming, Kim said no, she was going to the Springs. What about Julian? Kim laughed, said he was too busy fucking Beverly Hills lawyers for money. Clay was about to ask what she meant when someone called her name. The liquor guy had arrived. She walked off, and Clay looked past the big lighted pool, out over Hollywood's blanket of lights under a neon purple sky. Blair asked if he was okay. He said sure. A young guy, 18 or 19, carried in a large cardboard box, set it on the bar. Kim signed, tipped him, and he wished them a happy new year and left. She pulled out a bottle of Perrier Jouet, opened it expertly, and called for everyone to take one. It was chilled. Muriel ran over, hugging Kim, saying she'd been convinced, and took a bottle. She asked if Spit was pissed at her. All she'd said was he looked dead. Kim said he was just on edge. The wind was weird. Muriel called him a moron, recounting that he'd claimed to have done well in school before being kicked out. What did that even mean? And added that he used a blowtorch to freebase. Kim shrugged and drank. Blair told Muriel she looked wonderful. Muriel returned the compliment, and then begged Clay for his vest, a gray and white argyle with one dark red triangle that, she said, looked like he'd been stabbed. Tired, he pulled it off and handed it over. She put it on, laughing, promising to give it back. An irritating photographer moved through the room, taking pictures of everyone, pointing his camera in their faces. He caught Clay, the flash blinding him for a second. He took another swallow from a champagne bottle. Kim lit candles everywhere. Spit put on an X album. Someone pinned half-inflated balloons to a bare wall, where they hung limply. The door to the pool and veranda stood open, with a couple of balloons pinned there, and they walked outside toward the water. Blair asked what Kim's mother was doing. Was she still seeing Tom? Kim laughed, asked if she'd read it in the Inquirer. Blair said she'd seen a picture in the Hollywood Reporter. Kim repeated that her mother was in England with Milo, at least according to Variety. Then Blair asked who Kim was seeing. Kim laughed, named some famous young actor. Clay thought they'd gone to school with him, but couldn't quite remember. Blair said she'd heard about it, and wanted to verify. Kim confirmed it. Blair noted he hadn't been at Kim's Christmas party. Kim looked worried, asked if she was sure. Blair insisted, asked Clay if he'd seen him. He said no, not remembering. Kim found it weird, said he must have been on location. Blair asked how he was. Kim said nice, really nice. What about Dimitri? Kim dismissed it. Did he know? Probably. Did Blair think he was upset? Kim said Jeff was just a fling. She liked Dimitri. Dimitri sat by the pool on a chaise longue, tan, short blonde hair, playing strange, eerie chords on a guitar, repeating one riff over and over. Kim just watched him, silent. The phone rang inside. Muriel waved and called out that it was for Kim. Kim went back inside. Clay was about to ask Blair if she wanted to leave when Spit, still smoking the joint, came over with a surfer, telling Dimitri that Heston had some great acid. The surfer winked at Blair, patted Clay's ass, lit a cigarette. Spit asked where Kim was, but Dimitri didn't answer, just stared into the pool, strumming. For a moment, it looked like he might speak, but he only sighed and looked back at the water. A young actress entered with a well-known producer Clay had met once at one of Blair's father's parties. They surveyed the scene, walked over to Kim, who'd just gotten off the phone, and she told them her mother was in England with Milo. The producer said last he'd heard she was in Hawaii. They mentioned Thomas Noguchi might stop by, then left. Kim walked back to Blair and Clay, telling them Jeff had been on the phone. Blair asked what he said. Kim called him an asshole. He was down in Malibu with some surfer, holed up in his house. What did he want? To wish her a happy new year. Blair tried to put a positive spin on it. Kim's face twisted. He'd said, "Have a happy new year, cunt." She lit a cigarette, her champagne bottle nearly empty, looking close to tears, but before she could say more, Spit came over and said Muriel had locked herself in Kim's room. They all went inside, upstairs, down the hall to Kim's door. Kim tried it, found it locked, and knocked, calling Muriel's name. No answer. Spit pounded on the door, then kicked it. Kim told Spit not to damage the door, then called out again for Muriel to come out. Clay glanced at Blair, who looked worried, asking if she thought Muriel was all right. Kim didn't know. Spit wanted to know what she was on. Kim called Muriel's name once more. Spit lit another joint and leaned against the wall. The photographer came by and took pictures of them. The door opened slowly, and Muriel stood there looking like she'd been crying. She let them all in. Spit, Kim, Blair, the photographer. Clay then closed and locked the door behind them. Kim asked if she was all right. Muriel said she was fine, wiping her face. The room was dark, except for a couple of candles in the corner. Muriel sat down beside one of them, next to a spoon, a syringe, a folded piece of paper with brownish powder, and a piece of cotton. There was already something in the spoon. She wadded the cotton as small as possible, placed it in the spoon, stuck the needle in, and drew it into the syringe. Then she pulled up her sleeve, found a belt in the darkness, and wrapped it around her upper arm. Clay spotted the needle tracks, then looked at Blair, who was just staring at the arm. Kim asked what was going on, what Muriel was doing. Muriel didn't answer, just slapped her on to find a vein. Clay looked at his vest, the one Muriel was wearing, and it unsettled him to see that it really did look like someone had been stabbed. Muriel held the syringe. Kim whispered not to do it, but her lips trembled. Her eyes looked excited, the beginning of a smile forming, and Clay sensed she didn't really mean it. As the needle went into Muriel's arm, Blair stood up, announced she was leaving, and walked out. Muriel closed her eyes as the syringe slowly filled with blood. Spit said it was wild. The photographer took a picture. Clay's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. Muriel began to cry. Kim stroked her head, but Muriel kept crying and drooling, almost like she was laughing, her lipstick smeared across her lips and nose, mascara running down her cheeks. At midnight, Spit tried to light firecrackers, but only a few went off. Kim hugged Dmitri, who didn't seem to notice or care, dropping his guitar and staring off at the pool. About 11 or 12 of them stood outside by the water. Someone turned the music down so they could hear the city celebrating, but there wasn't much to hear. Clay kept looking into the living room, where Muriel lay on a couch, smoking a cigarette and sunglasses, watching MTV. All they could hear were windows breaking in the hills, dogs howling, a balloon bursting, Spit dropping a champagne bottle. The American flag draped over the fireplace stirred in the hot breeze. Kim got up and lit another joint. Blair whispered, "Happy New Year" to him, then took off her shoes and dipped her feet into the warm lit water. Fear never showed up. The party ended early. At home in the early morning, Clay sat in his room watching religious programs on cable, tired of videos. Two men, priests or preachers, 40-ish, in business suits and ties with pink-tinted sunglasses, talked about Led Zeppelin records, claiming that played backwards, they contained alarming passages about the devil. One stood up, snapped a record in half, and declared that as God-fearing Christians they would not allow it. He expressed worry about harm to young people, the future of the country, he screamed, and broke another record. Rip called Julian, wanted to see Clay. Julian didn't have his number, Rip said, so he'd given it to him. Clay noted Julian hadn't called. Rip said Julian needed to talk and would be at the Chinese theater at 3:30. Clay asked what he was doing there. Rip's response implied Clay should know. Clay decided to meet him. He drove to the Chinese theater on Hollywood Boulevard and looked at the footprints for a while. A young couple not from L.A. took pictures of the prints. A suspicious-looking Oriental man stood by the ticket booth. Otherwise, the place was empty. A tan blonde usher at the door claimed he recognized Clay from a party 2 Decembers ago in Santa Monica. Kickers party, he said. Clay didn't remember. He asked if the concession stand was open. The usher let him in, and he bought a Coke. The usher mentioned the movie had already started. Clay said that was fine, he didn't want to see it. The suspicious Oriental man kept checking his watch, then finally left. Clay finished his Coke and waited until around 4. Julian never appeared. He drove to Trent's house, but Trent wasn't there. He sat in Trent's room, put a movie in the Betamax, and called Blair to ask if she wanted to do something that night, a club or a movie. She said yes. He began drawing on a piece of paper near the phone, recopying numbers. Blair told him Julian wanted to see him. He said he'd heard, asked what for. She didn't know Julian, just said he had to talk. She didn't have his number. The Bel Air house numbers had been changed. Julian was probably at the Malibu house, but she wasn't sure. She added that he probably didn't want to see Clay that badly anyway. Clay said maybe he'd stop by Bel Air. Blair said okay. He told her to call if she wanted to do anything tonight. She agreed, and after a long silence, said okay once more and hung up. Julian wasn't at the Bel Air house, but a note on the door said he might be at a house on Kings Road. He wasn't there either. In the backyard, a guy with braces, short platinum blonde hair, and a bathing suit was lifting weights. He put one down, lit a cigarette, and offered Clay a quaalude. Clay asked where Julian was. A blonde, drunk girl by the pool in a chaise longue said in a tired voice that Julian could be anywhere. Did he owe Clay money? She had a television outside, watching a movie about cavemen. Clay said no. She remarked. That was good. Julian had promised to pay her for a gram of coke but never did. A half-empty bottle of gin sat beside her. The weightlifter asked if Clay wanted to buy a bootleg Temple of Doom cassette. Clay said no, then asked him to tell Julian he'd stop by. The weightlifter nodded vaguely. The girl asked if he'd gotten backstage passes to the Missing Persons concert. He said yeah, baby, and she jumped in the pool. A caveman got thrown off a cliff in the movie, and Clay left. On the way back to his car, Clay bumped into Julian, pale beneath his tan, looking unwell enough that Clay half expected him to collapse. Julian managed a greeting, and Clay returned it. Julian suggested getting stoned. Clay declined. Julian said he was glad Clay had come by. Clay mentioned he'd heard Julian wanted to see him. Julian confirmed it, then asked for money. Clay pressed for details, but Julian deflected, suggesting they go to the Galleria. Clay didn't want to go, didn't want to lend money either, but the afternoon stretched ahead with nothing else to do, so he followed Julian into Sherman Oaks. At a table in the Galleria, Julian picked at a cheeseburger without really eating, wiping ketchup off with a napkin. Clay drank a Coke. Julian said he needed cash. Clay asked what for. Julian offered fries instead of answering. Clay pushed for the point. Julian claimed it was for an abortion for some girl. Clay asked, who obviously some girl, but which one? Julian said she was living with friends in Westwood and asked directly if Clay would lend the money. Clay looked down at the people on the lower level, considered spilling his Coke over the railing, and finally agreed. Julian's relief was immediate. Clay asked if Julian had no money of his own. Julian explained. He had credit cards and a checking account, but his parents had frozen them. He didn't want to sell his Porsche, which would be a bummer, especially just for an abortion. He tried to laugh. Clay doubted he'd need to sell the Porsche and pressed again on what the money was really for. Julian got defensive, insisting it was for an abortion. The doctor expensive. She didn't want a clinic. Clay sighed, unconvinced. Julian swore it was true. Clay said he'd given the money, but wanted the truth. Julian repeated himself. They got up and walked around, passing two girls who smiled. Julian smiled back. In a punk clothing store, Julian examined police boots, found them weird-looking but liked them, put them down, started biting his nails, picked up a black leather belt. Clay asked if Julian remembered fifth-grade sports club after school, playing soccer, Magic Mountain on his 11th birthday. Julian said he couldn't remember. He put down the belt, and they left the Galleria. That afternoon, after Julian had asked for the money and said to bring it to his house in 2 days, Clay came home to a call from Rip, who asked if he'd gotten in touch with Julian. Clay said no. Rip asked if he needed anything. Clay said a quarter ounce. Rip was silent, then quoted 600. Clay looked at the Elvis Costello poster, then out the window, counted to 60. Rip still hadn't spoken by the time he finished. Clay asked if that was okay. Rip said okay. Tomorrow, maybe. Clay drove to a record store, browsed the aisles and bins, found nothing new he wanted, picked up some records to study the covers, and an hour passed before he realized it. Nearly dark outside. Spit walked in. Clay almost approached him to say hi and ask about Kim, but he spotted the track marks on Spit's arm and left the store instead, wondering if Spit would even remember him. Outside, he saw Alana, Kim, and a blonde rockabilly guy named Benjamin coming toward him. Too late to turn away, he smiled and walked up to them, and the four of them ended up at a sushi bar in Studio City. At the sushi bar, Alana said little, staring at her Diet Coke, lighting cigarettes and putting them out after a few drags. When Clay asked about Blair, Alana asked if he really wanted to know, then smiled grimly and remarked that he sounded like he really cared, which unsettled him, so he turned to Benjamin, who went to Oakwood. Benjamin's BMW had been stolen, and he'd been lucky enough to find a new one in the same off-green his father had originally bought. He seemed almost incredulous about his luck. Clay said he couldn't believe it either. Kim fed Benjamin a piece of sushi, and he sipped sake from a fake ID and launched into a rant about music, new wave, power pop, primitive muzak, all bullshit. He said rockabilly was where it was at, not the limp-wristed stray cats but real rockabilly. He was going to New York in April to check out the scene, maybe Baltimore. Clay echoed Baltimore. Kim said she liked rockabilly too, but still liked the psychedelic furs and the new Human League song. Benjamin dismissed the Human League as out. Over. Finish, Kim. Didn't know what was going on. Kim shrugged. Clay wondered where Dimitri was, whether Jeff was still holed up with some surfer in Malibu. Benjamin pressed on, insisting Kim didn't really know what was going on. He bet she didn't even read the face, and she had to. Had to. Clay asked why. Benjamin ran a hand over his pompadour and said otherwise she'd get bored. Clay said he guessed so, then made plans with Kim to meet her later at her house with Blair. He went home, had dinner with his mother, and afterward took a long cold shower, sitting on the floor of the stall, and letting the water pound down on him. He drove to Kim's house and found Blair sitting in Kim's room with a shopping bag from Jurgensen's over her head. When he entered, she tensed, startled, and reached to turn down the stereo, asking who it was. He identified himself. She took the bag off, smiling, and claimed she'd had the hiccups. A large dog lay at her feet. Clay leaned down to stroke its head. Kim came out of the bathroom, took a drag from Blair's cigarette, threw it on the floor and turned the stereo back up some Prince song. Blair commented that Clay looked like he was on acid. He said he'd just had dinner with his mother. The dog put the cigarette out with its paw and ate it. Kim mentioned an old boyfriend who'd had a bad acid trip, didn't come down for 6 weeks. His parents sent him to Switzerland. Blair watched the dog swallow the rest of the cigarette. Kim asked if she'd dressed down enough. Blair said yes, and told her to take off her hat. Kim asked Clay if she should. He shrugged, and said sure, why not, sitting on the bed. Kim suggested they go to the movies since it was early. Blair agreed, asking what was playing. The dog coughed and swallowed again. They drove to Westwood for a 10 o'clock movie about young sorority girls getting their throats slit and thrown into a pool. Clay barely watched, just the gory parts, his eyes drifting to the green exit signs at the back. The movie ended abruptly. Kim and Blair stayed for the credits, recognizing names. On the way out, they spotted Lene, and Blair grabbed Clay's arm with an anxious warning. Kim echoed it, telling them not to mention they'd seen her on MV3 that day. Too late, Blair smiled and said hello. Lene, too tan in faded jeans and a revealing Hard Rock Cafe t-shirt, was with a young blonde boy also too tan, in sunglasses and shorts. Lene squealed with recognition, hugging them both. She introduced Troy. Blair introduced Clay. They shook hands with limp, shaky grips. Lene asked if they'd watched MV3. Blair and Kim said no. Lene explained she couldn't see herself on it. Thought she caught a glimpse once but wasn't sure, and Troy was on it but they'd missed her. Got some valley bitch dancing next to him instead, Blair suggested. Maybe they'd repeat it so she could look more closely, Kim agreed, grinning. Lene asked hopefully if they would. Clay lit her cigarette. Blair assured her they rerun everything. They never made it to Nowhere Club. Kim got lost and forgot the address, so they went to Barney's Beanery instead. Sitting in silence while Kim talked about her party and Clay shot pool. Blair ordered a drink, showed a fake ID, got it, and handed it to Kim, who downed it fast, and ordered another. They talked about how bad Lane had looked on MV3. Trent called the next night, depressed, out of coke, unable to find Julian, having girl problems. He started to describe a party in the hills the night before but stalled. He thought she was seeing someone else. They didn't have it together. He was bummed. Clay asked flatly if he was bummed out. Trent suggested a movie. Clay took a while to respond, distracted by a cable video of buildings blowing up in slow motion in black and white. On the way to the Beverly Center, Trent smoked a joint and mentioned that the girl lived nearby and that Clay looked a little like her. Clay said great. Trent went on about how fucked up girls were, especially this one on cocaine, prelude, and speed. He passed the joint, rolled down the window, stared at the sky. At the empty, bright Beverly Center, all stores closed. They walked up to the top floor where the movies played. The whiteness of floors, ceilings, and walls was overpowering. They saw no one until the theaters, bought tickets, and walked to Theater 13 completely empty. They shared another joint inside the hollow room. Exiting the theater 90 minutes or 2 hours later, a pink-haired girl with roller skates slung over her shoulders approached Trent, squealing about how the place was a scream. Trent, stoned and half asleep through the second half, asked what she was doing there. She was just hanging around. He introduced her to Clay. She flirted, asked what movie they'd seen. Trent said number 13. She asked the title, he forgot, and Clay shrugged. He had too. She asked for a ride. Trent said Clay drove. Clay agreed. On the way through the mall, a security guard on a white bench told her no roller skating. She dismissed it with a casual "too much" and rolled away. In Clay's car, she mentioned she'd just finished singing background vocals on Banderasta's new album. The pink-haired girl in the back seat complained about the musician who kept calling her by a nickname she hated, though she didn't explain why. He didn't bother asking who the musician was. instead steering the conversation toward whether she actually sang for a living. She deflected, describing herself as a hairdresser who dropped out of university after getting mono, and mentioned she also painted something she'd apparently left at a band's house, possibly for use in a music video, before losing her train of thought entirely and laughing. He noticed Trent had passed out beside him and elbowed him hard in the ribs to rouse him. Trent jolted awake, insisting he was alert, and rolled down his window. The girl, forgetting the thread again, asked what he'd originally wanted to know. He repeated the question with mounting irritation, struggling to keep his own eyes open. She answered that she cut hair at a salon, then abruptly demanded he turn up the radio for a song she loved, mentioning a band playing at a venue on Friday. He shouted at Trent to wake up fully, and Trent, blinking, assured him his eyes were just tired before glancing around the car and complimenting the girl's hair. She explained she'd done it herself, launching into a dream about watching the entire world melt from a boulevard intersection, a vision so vivid she'd decided to alter her appearance with a piercing and pink dye as a kind of charm to prevent the apocalypse. He found himself nodding along despite her unsettling conviction, then pulled up to a hot dog stand. She stumbled badly climbing out of the back seat, ending up on the sidewalk laughing as he drove away. He asked Trent where he'd met her, but the question hung unanswered as they passed a billboard that read, "Disappear here," and a stray thought crossed his mind, someone's availability, his own perhaps, before Trent deflected and offered a joint. The next afternoon, he drove to Julian's Bel Air house with a green envelope of cash. He found Julian sprawled on his bed in a wet swimsuit, watching MTV in a room so dark, the only illumination came from the flickering black and white images on the television. He announced he'd brought the money and set the envelope down, assuring Julian there was no need to count it. Julian thanked him flatly. He pressed Julian on what the money was really for, and Julian turned the question back on him. Why did it matter? He answered that the sum was substantial, and Julian countered with a question about why he'd given it at all. He said it was because Julian was a friend, though the statement came out uncertain, like a question. Julian's response was dismissive and hollow, and he watched Julian's attention drift back to the screen as another video began. Before he could say anything more, Julian had fallen asleep. He left. Later, Rip called, suggesting they meet at a restaurant for lunch and to discuss business. He drove over, found a parking spot in back, and lingered in the car through the end of a song. A couple in a Jaguar waited behind him, assuming he was leaving, but he sat motionless until they honked and drove off. Inside, he took a seat at the bar and ordered a glass of red wine, then another, and by the time Rip arrived he'd finished 3. Rip greeted him with casual cheer, but he answered only with a blunt question about whether Rip had brought what they'd discussed. The tone shifted. Rip demanded a proper response, so he offered an empty assurance that he was fine. Rip seemed satisfied, and suggested they move to a booth once he finished his wine. He complied, leaving cash on the bar. In the booth, Rip commented on his tan, but he repeated his question. Rip told him to cool down, remarking on the heat it reminded him of last summer. He claimed not to remember. Across the street, an elderly woman with an umbrella collapsed to her knees. People gathered, and an ambulance arrived, though most inside the restaurant paid no attention. Rip insisted he must remember last summer. Fragments from that season drifted through his mind: clubs, a late-night albino sighting, a disturbing billboard with a hooded green skull, a transvestite in line at a movie. Many transvestites that summer. A dinner with Blair where she'd urged him not to leave for New Hampshire, a midget climbing into a Corvette, a Go-Go's concert with Julian, a party at Kim's with specific food and 2 English boys by the pool who all seemed to work at the same clothing store, a thin French boy Blair had slept with, a Rottweiler swimming laps, Rip with a plastic eyeball in his mouth. He'd spent that summer staring past palm trees at the skies. Later that night they were supposed to go to a concert, but Blair was too drunk, and when Kim spotted someone they disliked outside, they groaned, and Blair turned the car around. Another girl who was supposed to join them had nearly drowned earlier in her jacuzzi. Kim claimed a club had reopened somewhere, but after driving back and forth on the boulevard without finding it, Blair laughed in frustration and put on a tape. Kim yelled that they should just go to their usual spot. Blair agreed. And when he, drunk in the back seat, shrugged at the question of where to go, they ended up there anyway. He drank 2 more once inside. The DJ was shirtless with pierced nipples and a leather cowboy hat. Muttering the same phrase between songs, Kim remarked that he couldn't commit to a style. Blair introduced him to a friend who was on a new television show, and the friend was accompanied by a tall Matt Dillon lookalike. He and the lookalike went upstairs to do coke in a restroom stall above the sink. Someone had scrawled "Gloom Rules" on the mirror. Afterward, they sat at the upstairs bar, and the lookalike commented that nothing much was happening in the city. He nodded, watching the strobe light pulse across the dance floor. The lookalike lit his cigarette and started talking, but the music drowned him out. A surfer bumped into him, asked for a light, and the lookalike provided one with a smile, before mentioning he hadn't met anyone over 19 in 4 months, shouting over the noise about how mind-blowing that was. The lookalike spotted his dealer across the room and excused himself. He remained at the bar alone, lighting another cigarette and ordering another drink. Nearby, a heavy-set girl with heavy makeup sat by herself, sipping a diet soda through a straw, wearing designer jeans and cowboy boots, trying to engage the bartender who, like the DJ, was shirtless and dancing behind the counter to the club's thumping music. The bartender paid her no attention, and he found himself imagining her sitting alone in some room somewhere in the city, waiting for a phone that never rang. She ordered another soda. Downstairs, the music cut out, and the DJ announced an upcoming beach party at a venue in 2 weeks. The girl remarked to the bartender that the place felt lively tonight. He responded with a confused, "Where?" She glanced down, embarrassed, paid for her drink, and muttered something inaudible. "Somewhere," then buttoned her jeans and left. Sometime later that night, the realization settled over him. He still had 2 more weeks of being home. His psychiatrist had a new screenplay idea. He didn't listen, instead draping a leg over the arm of the black leather chair and lighting a clove cigarette. The man talked at length, stroking his beard and looking at him periodically. He kept his sunglasses on, though he was watching the doctor couldn't be sure. Eventually, the psychiatrist's words became meaningless noise, until he paused to ask if he'd like to collaborate. He declined. The doctor pressed, invoking their previous conversations about needing to become more active and less passive, suggesting that helping with at least a treatment would be a good step. He murmured something vague, blew clove smoke in the doctor's direction, and stared out the window. He parked outside Trent's Westwood apartment, the one he used during school. Rip answered the door. He'd become Trent's dealer since Julian was unreachable. Rip teased him with a guessing game about who was inside: young, rich, available, Iranian. He pushed him into the living room, revealing Atif, an acquaintance from graduation, lounging on the couch in Italian loafers and an expensive suit, now a freshman at USC with a black Mercedes. Atif greeted him warmly, asking how he'd been. He gave a non-committal reply, and Atif mentioned he'd just returned from Rome. Rip disappeared into Trent's room, turning on MTV loudly. He asked where Trent was. Atif said the shower, then complimented his appearance and asked about New Hampshire, which he dismissed as okay. Trent's roommate Chris sat at the kitchen table on the phone, smiling back at him before getting up to pace nervously. Atif chattered about Venice clubs and lost luggage in Florence, then lit a cigarette and explained he'd returned early for classes, though he wasn't sure when they started, and asked about a party he'd missed he hadn't, and Atif said it wasn't good anyway. He nodded along, watching Chris hang up and swear in frustration. Atif asked what was wrong. Chris explained his guitar had been stolen with drugs hidden inside that he was supposed to deliver. He asked Chris what he did. He hung around UCLA, maybe enrolled. Trent appeared in the doorway, damp from the shower, and suggested Chris play some of his music. Chris shrugged and put a tape on the stereo. From his vantage, he could see the steaming jacuzzi, beyond it a weight set and bicycles. He settled onto the couch, flipping through magazines spread on the table: fashion, music, a Playboy, the issue with Blair and her father, audio and surfing magazines, before his gaze drifted to a framed poster on the wall, its hypnotic blue lettering and palm shadows absorbing him. Trent mentioned someone who hadn't gotten into film school despite his father's successful television series and owning a Steadicam. The music played, but he barely heard it over Trent's complaints and Rip's hysterical laughter from the other room. Rip shouted that the rejection was due to heroin addiction. Trent dismissed it, but Rip insisted, claiming the guy practically ate the stuff raw and used to be normal. He called out, asking what normal even meant, but Rip clarified he meant truly normal. Atif expressed surprise at the revelation. Trent and Rip traded crude insults. Then Trent asked who'd made dinner reservations, a question that triggered a sense of déjà vu. He opened a fashion magazine, and faces from his sister's walls surfaced in his memory. The music continued, a childlike voice over an insistent drum machine repeating a refrain about not knowing where to go or what to do. Trent called out again about the reservations. Chris asked if anyone had meth. Rip claimed he'd made them. Chris asked again about meth. He told Chris they didn't have any. The song ended, and Trent insisted they hear the next one, but Chris ignored him, picking up the phone to call someone for drugs. He hung up looking defeated. Rip walked into the living room, announcing that a man had propositioned him at a salon, offering $600 for a weekend trip to the coast. Trent quipped that he probably wasn't the only one approached, then went to check the jacuzzi and asked Chris for cigarettes. Chris directed him to his room while dialing another number. He stared back at the poster, weighing whether to do the coke in his pocket now or wait until they got to dinner. Trent emerged from Chris's room, asking about someone asleep on the floor, apparently there for 2 days. Trent's annoyance was palpable, but Chris told him to leave the guy alone. He had mono or something. Trent declared they should go. Rip headed to the bathroom first, and he and Atif stood. Chris hung up the phone. Trent asked if he'd be there when they returned. Chris said no. He was heading to a certain neighborhood to look for meth. His dreams began peacefully. He was younger, walking home from school under an overcast sky streaked with gray, white, and purple clouds. Then rain started, and he ran. He ran through the downpour for what felt like an eternity before tripping into mud, falling flat, and sinking into the wet earth. Mud filled his mouth, his nose, his eyes, and he didn't wake until he was completely underground. Rain fell on Los Angeles. He read about houses sliding down hills in the night, and he stayed awake until dawn, wired on coke, watching over his own house. In the damp mornings, he'd retrieve the paper, read the film section, and try to ignore the weather. Nothing much happened during those rainy days. One of his sisters bought a fish and put it in the jacuzzi, where the heat and chlorine killed it. He received strange phone calls late at night. Someone would call his number, stay silent for 3 minutes, sigh, and hang up. Street lights on Sunset short-circuited, flashing yellow-green, then yellow again, sometimes red and green simultaneously. He got a message that Trent had stopped by in an expensive suit, driving someone else's Mercedes, and had left word that someone named Scott had overdosed. He didn't know who Scott was. The rain continued. That night, after 3 more silent calls, he threw a glass against the wall. No one came to check. He lay awake, took Valium to come down from the coke, but sleep wouldn't come. He turned off MTV, tried the radio, but couldn't get the station, so he stood nude at the window, staring across the valley at the neon and fluorescent lights beneath the purple sky, watching clouds pass, then lay back down, trying to count how many days he'd been home, pacing, lighting cigarettes, waiting for the phone to ring. This was how rainy nights went. At Spago with Trent and Blair, Trent claimed he spotted people doing cocaine at the bar, and he told him to go join them. Trent told him to shut up. They'd done half a gram before leaving the apartment, so none of them were hungry. They ordered only appetizers and a pizza, drinking grapefruit juice and vodka. Blair kept smelling her wrist and humming to a new song playing over the stereo. When the waiter brought their 4th round of drinks, she asked if he'd been at a club the other night. He just smiled and shook his head. She then asked Trent if someone named Walker was really an alcoholic. Trent confirmed it, and Blair remarked that Walker was great. Nice. Trent agreed, then looked at him, startled. He chimed in that Walker was nice, though he had no idea who they were talking about. They all agreed Walker was nice. Trent mentioned he was going to the desert the next day to watch a gardener plant cacti. He found the task absurdly typical, but had agreed out of guilt when his mother played the "you never do anything for me" card also. He'd heard there would be good coke there. Blair smiled at him. As midnight approached and someone paid the check, he confessed to Trent once Blair went to the restroom that he didn't know who Walker was. Trent told him he didn't make sense. He defended himself, but Trent insisted he was ridiculous, a fool. The exchange became circular and frustrating. Trent finished his drink and asked who he was sleeping with. He deflected, saying it was none of anyone's business, but Trent scoffed. He turned the question back on Trent. Trent suggested he didn't get it, and he pushed back, growing defensive. If this was about Blair, she should know better they weren't together, and Trent should understand that. Trent finally asked if he'd told her. He admitted he hadn't. Trent called it tacky. Blair returned, and when she asked what was tacky, Trent deflected, naming someone else. He stayed seated, not wanting to leave them alone. Blair defended the person Trent named. Trent disagreed. They argued briefly, and Blair, standing up, said something about not spending enough time with him. Trent stood too, and Blair laughed, saying maybe that was true. He wondered if she'd done coke in the bathroom, probably, and whether it mattered. Waiting for the car, Blair and Trent exchanged smiles that irritated him. Blair looked up at the cloudy sky as light rain began to fall. They got into her car, and she played a tape she'd made. Trent asked about a different mix, and she said she'd burned it from overuse. He believed her, and rolled down the window as they drove to a late nightclub. At the club, a 16-year-old tan girl beside him lamented the radio station's playlist. Blair sat across from him next to Trent, who was doing an impression for two blonde girls. Rip came over after speaking with a gay porn star and whispered something to Blair. They both left. The girl beside him, drunk, hand on his thigh, asked if a venue had burned down, and he casually confirmed it. Blair and Rip returned, both hyper-alert, Blair's head jerking, watching dancers, Rip's eyes scanning for someone. Blair picked up a crayon and began drawing on the table. Rip spotted his companion. A tall blonde boy approached, and one of the girls with Trent jumped up, surprised to see him. She'd thought he was in a coma. He explained his license had been revoked for drunk driving. Blair kept drawing, and the boy sat down. He thought he spotted Julian leaving, so he got up, went to the bar, then outside into the heavy rain. He could hear music from inside. A passing girl he didn't know said hi, and he nodded. In the restroom, he locked the door, stared at himself in the mirror, and ignoring the coke cried for about 5 minutes, leaning against the door as people knocked. He returned to the club. The darkness and crowd hid his swollen, red-eyed face. He sat next to the drunk girl, who was now talking with Blair about test scores. Griffin arrived with a beautiful blonde girl, flashed him a smile, and they went to the bar to talk with the porn star and his girlfriend. Eventually, the group dispersed in a blur of possible pairings. He ended up dancing with a girl who whispered she wanted to go back to her place. They crossed the crowded dance floor. She went to the restroom, and he waited at a table for her. On the table where he waited, someone had scrawled, "Help me," over and over in red crayon, the letters childlike with little curls on the E's, surrounded by phone numbers and other illegible marks. The two red words stood out starkly. The girl returned, and they walked out past a crying girl in the doorway, a porn star smoking in the alley, and a group of Mexican guys harassing clubgoers while a security officer and parking attendant tried to move them along. One of them called out a slur, but he and the girl ignored it, got into her car and drove into the hills. In her room, he undressed and lay on the bed while she went to the bathroom. She emerged in a towel, sat beside him, and he reached for her shoulders. She told him to stop. He let go, and she directed him to lean against the headboard. She dropped the towel, retrieved suntan lotion from a drawer, and handed it to him, then produced a pair of sunglasses and told him to put them on. He did. She took the lotion, applied it to herself, and motioned for him to do the same. He started, then reached for her. She stopped him, guiding his hand back to himself. They continued this way until he said he was close. She told him to wait, that she was almost there too. She moved faster, legs widening, leaning back against the pillows. He removed the sunglasses. She told him to put them back on. He did, and when he came, it stung. She came as well, then got up, flushed, turned off the music and put on MTV. He lay there, still wearing the sunglasses, as she handed him tissues. He cleaned up and flipped through a magazine beside the bed. She put on a robe and stared at him. Thunder rumbled, and rain intensified. She lit a cigarette as he dressed. He called a cab, finally took the sunglasses off, and she warned him to be quiet on the stairs to avoid waking her parents. The cab took him back to Trent's apartment in the heavy rain. In his car he found a note on the passenger seat. "Have a good time?" and recognized Blair's handwriting. He drove home. The next day, coming down from coke and sneezing blood, he sat in his psychiatrist's office. The doctor wore a red V-neck over bare skin and cut-off jeans. He started crying uncontrollably. The psychiatrist looked at him, fingering a gold necklace, then wrote something down. He asked a question, and he replied that he didn't know what was wrong. Maybe his parents, his friends, getting lost while driving, the drugs. The doctor acknowledged that he recognized these issues, but said that wasn't what he was really asking. He got up, straightened a framed magazine cover with a musician on it, the word "repents" in large letters. He waited for the question. The psychiatrist asked about the musician, had he seen him, where he was now, thoughts on his latest work. He turned the focus back on himself, asking what about him. The doctor said he'd be fine. He expressed doubt. The doctor suggested changing the subject. He screamed, demanding to know what about him. The psychiatrist told him not to be so mundane. He remembered his grandfather's birthday in Palm Springs, where they'd been too long. The sun was hot, the air thick. It was lunchtime beneath the pool overhang at the old house. His grandmother had given him rock candy, which he chewed nervously. The housekeeper brought a platter of cold cuts, beer, punch, and chips to the table, where his aunt, grandparents, parents, and he sat. His mother and aunt picked at turkey sandwiches. His grandfather wore a jockstrap and straw hat, drinking Michelob. His aunt fanned herself with a magazine. His grandmother, unwell, nibbled and sipped tea. His mother watched his sisters and cousins splash in the pool. His aunt said they'd been there too long. His father agreed. It was an understatement. She said she wanted to leave. His grandfather said they should get going, joking about his sunburn and winking at him, opening another beer. His aunt said she'd make flight reservations. His cousin mentioned a plane crash in San Diego from a newspaper. The conversation shifted. Plans forgotten. His aunt found it awful. His father said he'd prefer a plane crash to any other death, quick, painless, especially with alcohol and sedatives. Silence fell. His aunt asked his mother what she thought. She said she didn't think about things like that. His grandmother, who'd been quiet all day, simply said she wouldn't want to die at all. He drove to Trent's house but remembered Trent was in Palm Springs, so he went to Rip's. A blonde kid in a bathing suit answered, saying Rip was gone. He left, and as he pulled onto Wilshire, Rip pulled up in his Mercedes, leaning out to say he and Spin were going to a cafe and to meet them there. He followed, the plate climax shimmering. The cafe was closed. An old man in rags and a black hat, talking to himself, stood in front and scowled at them. Rip rolled down his window and he pulled alongside. He asked where they wanted to go. Rip said Spin wanted to go to another restaurant. He said he'd follow. It began to rain. At the restaurant, Spin said he'd gotten good stuff that afternoon. A man at the next table sat with eyes tightly closed. His companion ate a salad, unfazed. He felt relieved when the man finally opened his eyes. Still, Spin talked, and he tried to change the subject, asking about Julian's whereabouts. Spin said he'd been ripped off on otherwise good coke from Julian. Rip said Julian had too many hang-ups, constantly strung out, selling great coke and smack but stooping to junior high customers, which was low. He repeated the word, taking it in. Rip added that some said a 13-year-old who overdosed got the smack from Julian. He asked Rip what he'd been doing. Not much. Animal tranquilizers, a concert where rats were thrown into the audience, one killed in the car. Spin said he'd just returned from Vegas, hanging at his father's hotel. Rip turned the question back on him. Not much, he said. Rip agreed. There wasn't much to do anymore. Spin nodded. After dinner, they shared a joint in the car on the drive out to Malibu, heading to buy coke from someone. In the cramped back seat, he initially misheard the name as Ed, But when Spin asked how they knew Dead would be available, and Rip replied that he was always around, the name clicked. There was a party at Dead's house. The people there, mostly young boys, gave the three of them strange looks, probably because they weren't in swimsuits. They approached Dead, a man in his mid-40s wearing briefs, reclining on a pile of pillows, two tan boys beside him watching HBO. Dead handed Rip a large envelope. A pretty blonde in a bikini sat behind Dead, petting one of the boys' heads. Dead lisped a warning about being more careful. Narcotics officers were everywhere in the area. Rip asked why. Dead explained that one of his acquaintances had been shot in the leg by a narc. The kid was only 17. Spin expressed disbelief. Dead asked if they knew him. Randall, a student at a certain school. Spin shook his head. Music burst from ceiling speakers. Dead repeated the warning. Spin echoed it, licking his lips at the girl still stroking the boy's hair. The boy winked and pouted. In the car, Spin tasted the coke and declared it cut with too much Novocaine. Rip said he didn't care. He just wanted to use it. He turned up the radio, screaming a question about what would happen to all of them. Spin shouted back, asking who exactly he meant. They did some coke, then went to an arcade in Westwood, playing video games for nearly 2 hours, spending about $20 each. They only stopped when they ran out of quarters. Rip had only $100 bills, and the arcade wouldn't make change, so he stuffed the cash back and cursed at the attendant. They returned to the car and finished the rest of the coke. Blair's father hosted a party for a young Australian actor whose film opened the next week. He was trying to cast the actor in his new $30 million sci-fi film, but the actor's price was too high. He went hoping to talk to Blair, but she wasn't visible. Only actors and her film school friends. Jared was there, persistently hitting on the Australian actor, asking if he'd seen specific episodes of a classic TV show. The actor kept saying no. Jared listed more episodes. The actor, sweating and drinking heavily, kept saying he hadn't seen any of them. Finally, the actor walked away, and Jared was joined by his new boyfriend, a costume designer from Blair's father's last film, who might or might not work on the new project. The actor approached his wife, who ignored him. Kim told him the couple had fought that afternoon. The wife had stormed to a salon and had all her hair cut off red and clothes cropped, with white patches visible at certain angles. Conversation turned to storm damage in Malibu. Someone mentioned a house that had collapsed entirely, one moment there, the next gone. Blair's mother nodded, lips trembling, glancing repeatedly at Jared. He was about to ask her where Blair was, but a group of actors, a director, and studio executives entered, fresh from the Golden Globe Awards, and she moved to greet them. An actress swept in, hugged the costume designer, and loudly whispered instructions to get a drink for someone who'd lost, and something for herself before she collapsed. The costume designer snapped orders at the bartender, who moved abruptly, unconvincingly, to comply. People asked about the winners, but the actress and most of the new arrivals had forgotten. The director remembered and recited names, and if asked about competition, he listed them alphabetically. He started talking to a film school student, very tan with a blonde beard, glasses, and torn tennis shoes, who kept discussing aesthetic indifference in American movies. They sat alone in the den until Alana, Kim, and Blair entered and sat down. Blair wouldn't look at him. Kim touched the film student's leg, asking where he'd been the night before. He said he'd smoked and gone to a horror movie screening. He tried to catch Blair's eye, but she avoided him. Jared, Blair's father, the director, and the costume designer joined them, and the talk turned to the Australian actor. Blair's father asked the director why the actor was in town. The director thought it might be about an Oscar nomination, though the father dismissed the film it was for. He then called Blair over, motioning for her to sit on his lap. She stared incredulously, then smiled, and walked out. Silence followed. The director said if they couldn't get the actor, they needed another star. Names were suggested. The costume designer mentioned a delicious boy from a past film, struggling to recall the name. Blair returned with a drink, glanced at him, and he looked away, feigning interest in the conversation. The costume designer slapped his knee, yelping the name Marco and variants before giving up. Suggestions were thrown out. Marco King? Marco Katz? each dismissed. He asked if anyone had seen the film. Its release date was debated. Blair supplied the correct full name. The costume designer confirmed it. Jared said he thought the actor had overdosed. The film student asked if he'd seen it. He nodded, though he hadn't liked it, and asked if the student had been bothered by the way characters were dropped for no reason. The student said it happened in real life too, looking at Blair, but she wouldn't look back. Blair's father asked if the actor was Italian. Kim and Alana called him gorgeous, a babe. The director, grinning, leaned toward Kim, asking who else she thought was gorgeous. Blair's father encouraged input from the girls. Jared added the reminder, no great actors, just someone whose physique matched his face. The costume designer nodded in firm agreement. Blair reminded her father that she'd been asking him to cast either of two specific musicians, and he assured her that he and the director had discussed it. If she wanted it badly enough, he thought something could be arranged. He turned to Alana and Kim, asking their opinion on the idea. Kim said she'd see it. Alana said she'd see it twice. Kim added she'd buy the video cassette. Blair's father agreed with his daughter, saying they should seriously consider one of the musicians, though he mispronounced the name, and Blair corrected him. The director smiled at Kim and suggested they get the musician. Asking what she thought, she blushed and said that would be great. Blair's father announced they'd call both musicians for readings the next week. Blair thanked him. He told her anything she wanted. Jared warned the director to check the musician's physique first, and the director assured him they would, still smiling at Kim, asking if she wanted to be there when they did. Blair finally looked at him with a pained expression, and he glanced at Kim, feeling shame and then anger. Kim blushed again and said maybe. Julian hadn't called since he'd given him the money, so he decided to call the next day. He didn't have the number, so he called Rip, but Rip was gone. A kid answered. He called Trent's apartment. Chris answered, said Trent was still in Palm Springs, and asked if he knew anyone with meth. Finally he called Blair, who gave him Julian's number. He started to apologize for the night at the club, but she cut him off, saying she had to go, and hung up. He called the number. A girl with a familiar voice answered. She said Julian was either in Malibu or Palm Springs. He asked what he was doing. She didn't know. He asked for numbers at either place. She only knew he was staying at one of two houses. She paused, uncertain, then asked if he was someone else. He said no, just needing the number. Another pause. A sigh. She said she didn't know where he was, couldn't tell him, and asked again who he was. He gave his name. A longer pause. He said not to tell Julian he called. He'd get in touch later. She asked if he was sure. He said yes. As he started to hang up, she asked the other name again. He hung up. That night, he went to Kim's party and met Evan, who claimed to be a close friend of Julian's. The next day, around 3 p.m, they met at a fast food place after Evan got out of school. He asked if Julian was in Palm Springs. Evan responded enthusiastically about the desert, deflecting the question, suggesting they go there sometime. He pressed, and Evan kept talking about the beauty of the place and Aspen. He asked again if Julian was there. Evan seemed confused, wondering why Julian would be at Aspen. He excused himself to the restroom but went to a phone instead, calling Trent, who'd returned from Palm Springs. He asked if Trent had seen Julian there. Trent said no and complained about the quality of the coke he'd gotten. He told Trent he couldn't find Julian and was strung out and tired. Trent asked where he was. He said a fast food place in the valley. Trent's response was cryptic. That's why? And he didn't understand but hung up. Rip said you could always find people at a certain late-night spot in Encino. They drove there one night because another place was too crowded. He and Rip went to the quieter spot where various acquaintances were gathered. Sophie sat with him, bringing over 2 boys in a band who seemed calm and cautious. Sophie talked about a concert she'd slept through after her brother gave her a bad sedative. Rip asked about someone else's whereabouts. Sophie said he was at a house in Newport. One of the boys with a huge, stiff black hair said people always moved away from him at the other place, which was why he came here. Sophie fell asleep on his shoulder, and his arm went numb, but he didn't move it. The other boy, in sunglasses and a band shirt, said he'd seen him at Kim's New Year's party. He nodded and claimed to remember. though he hadn't been there. They talked about music, the local scene, and the rain. Rip made faces at an elderly Mexican couple across from them, leering and grinning. He excused himself to the bathroom. On the wall, 2 crude jokes were written, and below them, a statement about Julian giving good head and being dead. He remembered the last week in the desert, when almost everyone had gone, only his grandparents, parents, and he remained. All the staff had left. His sisters and aunt had gone to San Francisco. Everyone was tired of Palm Springs. They'd been there off and on for 9 weeks, the last 3 in Rancho Mirage. Nothing much happened. A couple of days before leaving, his grandmother bought a blue purse. His parents took her to a party. He stayed with his grandfather, who'd drunk himself to sleep. The pool was being drained, the waterfall off. Someone had found a rattlesnake in the remaining water, and his parents warned him not to go outside. That warm night, he ate leftovers and watched a television rerun. He took a walk. The streets were empty, the palm trees trembling, streetlights bright. Beyond the house, the desert was black. No cars passed. He thought he saw a snake slither into the garage. The darkness, wind, rustling hedges, and an empty cigarette box on the driveway unnerved him. He ran inside, turned on all the lights, and fell asleep to the moan of the desert wind. Late Saturday night, they gathered at Kim's house, with nothing to do but drink and watch old movies. He stared at a portrait of Kim's mother above the bar. The only plan was to check out a new club downtown, so Dmitri, Kim, Alana, Blair, and he decided to drive there. The club occupied the top floor of a 4-story parking structure, the lower levels abandoned save for a few cars left overnight. The music hit hard from the moment he stepped onto the concrete floor, a thick fog of sweat, spilled beer, and gasoline fumes hanging in the air. Bodies moved in the dim light, and he recognized faces, members of local bands scattered through the crowd, and Kim gestured toward the DJ booth, pointing out familiar figures. Alana drifted off to talk to some English guys she knew from the clothing store, leaving him with Kim, who delivered a quiet observation. She didn't think Blair's feelings for him were what they used to be. He shrugged, turning toward an open window, his gaze drifting out into the night. The business district's towers rose dark and silent against the sky, lit only by a few scattered windows. A cathedral dominated the view, its rooftop cross a massive illuminated beacon, aimed at a moon that hung swollen and unsettlingly yellow, larger than he remembered. He looked back at Kim, saying nothing, and then spotted Blair on the dance floor with a young, pretty boy, both of them wearing expressions of genuine happiness. Kim murmured something about it being a shame, but her tone suggested she didn't mean it. Then Dmitri lurched over, drunk and unintelligible. He seemed about to address Kim, but instead thrust his hand through the open window. The glass caught his skin, and when he tried to pull back, the wound opened, ragged and deep. Blood spurted in uneven bursts, splashing thickly across the pane. After rushing him to an emergency room, they ended up at a coffee shop on Wilshire, sitting until nearly 4 a.m. before finally heading home. He killed time before meeting Blair by watching a religious broadcast. The preacher, a gray-haired man in pink-tinted glasses and wide lapels, spoke directly into the camera, his voice urgent and insistent. He promised deliverance, calling on viewers to confess their sins and feel the joy of salvation. Christ's neon image stood forlornly behind him. He sat there for almost an hour, waiting for some sign, some shift. Nothing happened. He got up, finished the cocaine he had hidden in his closet, and stopped for a drink before picking her up. He'd called her earlier about concert tickets, and her only response had been a flat agreement. At the bar, he considered dialing one of the numbers that had flashed across the television screen, but found he had nothing to say. The preacher's final plea stayed with him. Let this be a night of deliverance. Later, after the concert, he and Blair sat alone on Spago's patio, the night growing late. She sighed and asked for a cigarette, and they drank champagne cur. When she ordered her 6th, he suggested she might have had enough. Her response was sharp, defiant. She was hot, she was thirsty, and she'd order whatever she wanted. They shared Italian ice cream in a Westwood parlor, and she brought up an old science fiction film airing on cable that week. He asked, Which version? A flicker of paranoia surfacing, and she confirmed the remake. He looked down at his mostly untouched dessert. She asked if he'd felt the earthquake that morning. He hadn't. She said she thought maybe he had. In the parking lot he offered an apology, though he wasn't entirely sure what for. She told him it didn't matter. At a red light on Sunset, he kissed her, and she shifted into second, accelerating. A song he'd heard multiple times that day came on the radio, and he hummed along. She lit a cigarette. They passed a disheveled woman squatting by the freeway, her face turned toward the sun, eyes narrowed against the glare, surrounded by yellowed newspapers. Blair locked the doors. Driving through the hills on a quiet side street, she didn't see the coyote until it was too late. The car struck the animal hard, and she screamed, the cigarette falling from her lips. The coyote was caught beneath the wheels, squealing, and the car lurched with difficulty. She stopped, put it in reverse, and killed the engine. He didn't want to get out, but she was crying too hard, her head in her lap, so he stepped into the heat. The coyote lay on its side, trying to wag its tail, its eyes wide and frightened. Blood pooled from its mouth, its legs were crushed, its body convulsing. He watched it die in the sun, ignoring her calls. For 10 minutes, no cars passed. The coyote arched and shuddered 3 or 4 times before its eyes went white. Flies began to gather. He walked back to the car, and she drove off. At her house, she turned on the television and likely took something to calm down. They went to bed as a soap opera played. That night at Kim's party, while others played drinking games, he and Blair retreated to a couch and listened to music. She suggested moving to the guest house. They crossed past the illuminated pool, and once inside, they came together with an urgency he hadn't felt before. They fell to their knees, her hands under his shirt, his face buried in her jasmine-scented hair. Their jeans came undone, and when he entered her too quickly she gasped, and he forced himself to remain still. He sat with his father at Trump's. His father had a new Ferrari and a cowboy hat he thankfully left in the car. He urged his son to consult his astrologer and buy the Leo horoscope for the coming year. His father talked about planetary vibes affecting the body. He nodded, agreeing vaguely. The window was open, and he let the warm breeze ruffle his hair, closing his eyes for a moment before glancing toward the hills. A businessman interrupted. He'd asked his mother to come, but she'd refused, lying by the pool reading a magazine. She didn't want to go anywhere, even for drinks. One of his sisters had shrugged from her lounge chair as he'd walked away. After the businessman left, his father fell silent. He tried to fill the space with talk, mentioning the coyote, and his father dismissed it with a shrug, his attention drawn to the red Ferrari outside. His father asked if he was looking forward to returning to New Hampshire. He met his father's gaze and said yes. He woke to voices outside. The director from the night before sat at the poolside table with his wife, having brunch. His grandmother looked well in the shade. The director spoke of a stuntman who had died on set, a young man, only 18, who had missed a step and fallen headfirst onto the pavement. He was a wonderful boy, the director said. His father reached for another beer, the bottle opening with a quiet hiss. His grandfather looked down, his expression heavy, and asked the director a simple question. What was the boy's name? The director seemed startled by the question, and his grandfather repeated it with a sad insistence. A long silence stretched out. He felt the desert breeze on his skin, heard the churn of the jacuzzi, the distant drain of the pool, and Frank Sinatra drifting from somewhere inside, singing about summer wind. He found himself hoping, with an intensity that surprised him, that the director would remember. The name had become suddenly, crucially important, but the director simply opened his mouth and admitted he'd forgotten. After lunch with his father, he drove to Daniel's house. The maid let him in and led him to the backyard, where Daniel's mother was playing tennis in a bikini, her skin slick with tanning oil. She stopped the ball machine and walked over, talking about trips to Japan and Aspen, then mentioned a strange dream she'd had about Daniel being kidnapped. She settled onto a chaise longue, took the lemon from her iced tea, and sucked on it while watching a young blond boy rake leaves from the pool. She complained of a migraine and said she hadn't seen her son in days. He went inside, climbed the stairs past a poster for Daniel's father's latest film, and waited in Daniel's room. After it became clear Daniel wasn't coming home, he left and drove to Kim's house to retrieve his vest. Screaming greeted him the moment he entered. The maid seemed unbothered, disappearing into the kitchen after letting him in. The house remained mostly unfurnished, and he passed the painted Nazi pots on his way to the pool. Muriel was the source of the noise, lying on a lounge chair with Kim and Dmitri. She fell silent as he approached. Dmitri, wearing black Speedos and a sombrero, tried to play an electric guitar, his hand freshly rebandaged after the incident at the club, each strum causing him to flinch. Muriel screamed again. Kim, smoking a joint, finally noticed him and got up, mentioning that her mother wasn't in England as she'd thought, but in Hawaii scouting locations for a film. She told him he should call before coming over. He claimed he'd tried, but no one answered a lie, though he realized even if he had called, it likely wouldn't have mattered. Muriel screamed again, and Kim, distracted, suggested he might have been calling disconnected numbers. He apologized and explained he'd only come for his vest. Kim said it was fine this once, but she didn't like people showing up unannounced anymore. Someone had been giving out her address. She used to enjoy company, she said, but now she couldn't stand it. He asked when she was going back to school, and she grew defensive, uncertain if classes had even started. In her room, it was only a mattress, a massive stereo, a Peter Gabriel poster, and a pile of clothes. Photos from her New Year's party were tacked above the bed, Muriel shooting up in his vest, him watching him standing in the living room, trying to open champagne, looking lost, Blair lighting a cigarette spit wasted beneath the flag. Outside, Muriel screamed again, and Dmitri kept struggling with the guitar. He asked what she'd been doing. She turned the question back on him. He had no answer. She pressed, and he said he did things, vaguely, his voice cracking as a brief image of the coyote surfaced. He pushed it down, wanting only to leave with his vest. She asked for an example. He deflected, asking about her mother. She was narrating a documentary about disabled teenagers, she said, then asked again what he did. He noticed the alphabet written on her wall, the letters out of order, and asked about her mother's other projects. She was doing a film in Hawaii. He asked if she'd spoken to her mother. She told him not to ask about her mother. He pushed again, and she found the vest, holding it out, her voice shaking as she asked why he kept asking. When he stood up, she sat on the mattress, and Muriel screamed from outside. Because, she sighed, she didn't know. He looked at her, and felt nothing, then walked out with his vest. He sat with Rip in a record store on Wilshire, where a young promotion executive was buying cocaine from Rip. The executive, platinum blonde and dressed entirely in white, said he needed some. Rip reached into his jacket. The executive remarked on the nice weather. Rip agreed. He echoed the sentiment. Rip asked about backstage passes to a concert, and the executive handed over 2 envelopes. Rip said he'd talk to him later and passed an envelope back. As they stood to leave, Rip asked if the executive had seen Julian. The executive picked up the phone, said nothing into it, and set it down. Rip picked up a demo of a new British band, then handed it to him. He studied it, and put it back. The executive grinned and suggested lunch. Rip asked again about Julian. The executive said he didn't know. Rip thanked him with a wink, and the executive leaned back, his eyes drifting upward. Trent called while Blair and Daniel were at his house, extending an invitation to a party in Malibu, and hinting that the band X might show up. Blair and Daniel thought it sounded like a good plan. He didn't really want to go or see Trent, but the clear day and the prospect of a drive to the coast won him over. Daniel was particularly interested in seeing which houses had been damaged by the recent storms. He drove carefully down the Pacific Coast Highway, mindful of his speed, while Blair and Daniel discussed a new album. When a familiar song came on the radio, they asked him to turn it up and sang along, their voices a mix of genuine and ironic enthusiasm. The air cooled as they approached the ocean, the sky shifting to purple and gray. They passed an ambulance and 2 police cars parked by the roadside, and Daniel craned his neck to see. He slowed down. Blair speculated they were searching for an accident scene, and a brief silence fell over the car. X wasn't at the party, and neither were many others. Trent answered the door in just a pair of briefs, explaining that he and a friend were house-sitting while the owner was in Aspen. He spent a lot of time there, as did his friends, mostly blonde, pretty male models. He told them to help themselves to drinks and food, then returned to the jacuzzi, stretching out beneath the darkening sky. The house was full of young men who seemed interchangeable: thin, tanned bodies, short blonde hair, blank blue eyes, empty voices. He started to wonder if he looked just like them. He pushed the thought away, got a drink, and surveyed the living room. 2 boys played a video game. Another lay on an overstuffed couch, smoking a joint and watching MTV. One of the players missed a move and struck the machine in frustration. 2 Dobermans ran along the empty beach. One of the blonde boys called them by name, and the dogs bounded onto the deck. The boy petted them. Trent complained about the service at a restaurant. The frustrated video game player approached and asked for the Ferrari keys and credit cards so he could buy more liquor. Trent told him to charge it and get plenty of tonic. The boy asked for the keys again, and Trent gestured vaguely toward the car. The sun began to break through the clouds. The boy with the dog sat next to Trent and started talking. He was also a model trying to break into film, but his agent had only landed him a fast food commercial. Then a voice from inside the house called Trent's attention. He winked at the others, urging them to follow. They walked down a hall to the master bedroom, where about 10 young men were gathered, plus the 2 dogs. Everyone was staring at a large television screen. On it, a nude teenage girl lay tied to a bed, her limbs spread, her body on what looked like newspaper. The black and white footage was grainy. The camera cut to a thin, scared teenage boy being pushed into the room by a large, naked black man. The boy stared at the camera with a panicked expression. The man tied him up on the floor, and he noticed a chainsaw in the corner of the room, its presence confusing him. The man had sex with the boy, then with the girl, and walked off screen. When he returned, he carried a toolbox. He produced an ice pick, a wire hanger, a package of nails, and a large knife, and approached the girl. Blair walked out. Daniel smiled and nudged him. He left quickly as the man tried to drive a nail into the girl's neck. Outside, he sat in the sun, lit a cigarette, and tried to steady himself. Someone turned up the volume, and from the deck he could hear the waves, the crying of seagulls, the hum of telephone wires, and the rustle of trees in the warm wind. The screams from the television carried through the open windows. 20 or 30 minutes later, after the sound stopped, Trent emerged. He noticed Trent had an erection. Trent adjusted himself and sat down, mentioning that someone had paid $15,000 for the film. The 2 video game players came out, and one expressed doubt that it was real, despite the intensity of the chainsaw scene. Trent insisted it was real. The other boy agreed, citing the impossibility of faking a castration. Trent seemed reassured. Daniel came out, smiling and red-faced, and he sat back in the sun. Later that afternoon, one of his grandfather's personal secretaries arrived, hunched, and wearing a string tie and a jacket with the hotel's insignia. He passed out licorice gum, and talked about the heat and the flight on the Learjet. He was accompanied by another aide, who wore a red baseball cap and carried clippings of Nevada's weather over the past 2 months. The men sat around, drinking beer and discussing baseball. His grandmother sat among them, her blouse hanging loose on her frail body, a blue and yellow kerchief tied tightly around her neck. He and Trent were standing around in Westwood, and Trent explained that the owner had returned from Aspen and kicked everyone out of the Malibu house. He'd be staying in the valley for a few days, then heading to New York for some shooting. When he asked what kind of shooting, Trent just shrugged and said it was shooting, vague and dismissive. He mentioned missing the beach and asked if he wanted to do some coke. He said yes, but not right then. Trent grabbed his arm roughly, demanding to know why. He explained that his nose hurt. Trent assured him it would help, suggesting they go upstairs at a nearby restaurant. They looked at each other. 5 minutes later, they were back on the street, and he didn't feel much better. Trent claimed he did, and wanted to go to the arcade. He also mentioned that a French acquaintance had overdosed on Friday. He didn't know who it was. Trent shrugged and asked if he'd ever mainlined. He hadn't. Trent's response was ominous. When they reached the car, a friend's Ferrari. His nose was bleeding. Trent said he'd need medication for the swelling in his nasal passages. He asked where to get that kind of thing. There was a long pause as Trent started the engine, and he asked if he was serious. His grandmother had taken a turn for the worse that afternoon, coughing up blood. She'd been losing her hair and weight due to pancreatic cancer. That night, as she lay in bed, the others talked about Mexico, bullfights, and bad movies. His grandfather cut his finger opening a beer. They ordered Italian food, delivered by a boy with a patch on his jeans. His grandmother came downstairs feeling a little better, but she didn't eat. He sat beside her, and his grandfather performed a magic trick with $2 silver. He asked if she'd seen it, too shy to meet her eyes. She said yes and tried to smile. He was about to fall asleep when Alana arrived unexpectedly, let in by the maid. She knocked on his door, and he waited before opening it. She'd been crying, sat on his bed, and mentioned something about an abortion, then laughed. He didn't know what to say, and apologized. She got up, walked to the window, and asked what he was sorry for. She lit a cigarette but couldn't smoke it. He said he didn't know. She laughed and looked out the window, and he thought she might cry. He wanted to move her away from the window, told her to come sit down, and she came to him, putting her arms around him, saying they'd all lost some kind of feeling. He tensed, and asked if it was Julian's. She said no, that he didn't know him. She fell asleep, and he went downstairs to sit by the jacuzzi, staring into the lighted, steaming water. Just before dawn, he went back to his room. Alana was standing by the window, smoking and looking out over the valley. She said she'd bled a lot last night and felt weak. They went to breakfast in Encino. She kept her sunglasses on and drank a lot of orange juice. When they returned to his house, she thanked him as she got out of the car. He asked what for. She said she didn't know. She drove off. When he flushed the toilet, it clogged with Kleenex, and blood clouded the water. He put the lid down because there was nothing else to do. He stopped by Daniel's house later. Daniel was playing a video game, looking burnt and younger than he remembered. When he spoke, Daniel echoed him and nodded. He asked about a letter from school regarding next term's courses. Daniel ignored him, swapping game cartridges. He kept rubbing his mouth. When Daniel didn't answer, he asked what he'd been doing. Daniel said he was hanging out, around. He handed him a joint and matches. Daniel lit it and resumed playing. He told him about a 16-year-old girl he knew who met her dealer at a hotel and got injected with heroin repeatedly, then was taken to a party where she was assaulted by everyone there. He asked what Daniel thought. He said it was too bad. Daniel suggested it might be a good idea for a screenplay. He wasn't sure. Daniel said he wasn't going back to school. When asked why, he said he didn't know, that it felt like he'd never been there, like he'd been in L.A. forever. He was going to write a screenplay. He asked about his parents, and Daniel said they didn't care, that they were in Barbados and then maybe elsewhere. He told Daniel he should come back. Daniel said he didn't see the point, and he began to wonder if there ever was a point. Daniel got up, turned off the TV, and looked out the window, commenting on the strange, strong wind. He asked about a girl from school. Daniel seemed not to remember her. She might not be coming back, he said. He reminded him that she might. Daniel asked who she was. He walked to the window and said he was leaving in 5 days. Magazines lay by the pool, blown by the wind, one falling into the water. Daniel said nothing. Before leaving, he looked at Daniel lighting another joint, at the scar on his thumb and finger, and felt better for some reason. He was in a phone booth in Beverly Hills. His psychiatrist answered, and he identified himself. The psychiatrist asked where he was. He said he was in a phone booth in Beverly Hills. The psychiatrist asked if he was coming in that day. He said no. There was a pause, and the psychiatrist asked why not. He said he didn't think the sessions were helping much. Another pause. The psychiatrist asked if that was really why. He was confused by the question. The psychiatrist started to suggest something, but he cut him off. The psychiatrist asked where exactly in Beverly Hills he was. He said he didn't think he'd be coming back. The psychiatrist said he might call his mother. He told him to go ahead, that he didn't care, but he wasn't coming back. The psychiatrist tried to say something about how difficult things had been, but he told him to go fuck himself. On the morning of the last day, his grandfather's secretary West woke early, still in the same jacket and string tie. Wilson wore the same red baseball cap. West offered him bubble gum and said it would make him hum. He took 2 pieces. West asked if everyone was ready. He said he didn't know. The director's wife stopped by to say they were flying to Las Vegas for the weekend. His grandmother was taking pain medication. They left for the airport in a Cadillac. In the early afternoon, they boarded the plane and left the desert. Nothing was said in the empty airport lounge until his grandfather turned to his grandmother and said it was time to go. His grandmother died 2 months later in a hospital room on the edge of the desert. Since that summer, he remembered her in fragments playing cards, sitting on her lap on planes, the way she'd turned away from his grandfather when he tried to kiss her at a party. He remembered her at a hotel, giving him pink and green mints, and at a restaurant late at night, sipping red wine and humming a song to herself. He found himself standing at the gates of his elementary school. The grounds had changed, new grass, trees where asphalt used to be, dead trees now alive, the parking lot repaved. A large warning sign hung at the entrance, visible from his car. Classes were over, so he decided to walk through. He stopped at the gate, almost turning back, but stepped inside. It was the first afternoon in a long time he'd come back. He watched children on a jungle gym, spotted 2 teachers from his early years but didn't speak to them. Through a classroom window, he saw a little girl painting a picture of the city. From the next room, he heard the glee club practicing songs he'd forgotten. He used to drive past the school often, catching glimpses of children boarding buses and teachers laughing in the parking lot. He didn't think anyone else from his time there did the same. Once, he'd seen a boy from his first-grade class standing alone by the fence, gripping the wire and staring into the distance. He told himself the boy must live nearby. He sat on a bench, lit a cigarette, and noticed 2 payphones where there had been none. Mothers picked up their children, who ran across the yard into their arms. The sight made him feel peaceful, made him want to stay on the bench. But he got up and walked to an old bungalow he was sure had been his 3rd-grade classroom. It was being torn down, along with the cafeteria next to it. The paint was faded and peeling in large patches of pale green. He entered another bungalow. The day's homework was still on the blackboard. He read it carefully, then walked to the lockers but couldn't find his, couldn't remember which one it had been. In the boys' bathroom, he squeezed a soap dispenser. In the auditorium, he picked up a yellowed magazine and struck a few notes on a piano. The same piano he'd played at a Christmas recital in 2nd grade. The chords echoed through the empty room, and he panicked, leaving quickly. Outside, 2 boys were playing handball, a game he'd forgotten. He walked away without looking back, got in his car and drove off. He met Julian that same day in a rundown arcade on Westwood Boulevard. Julian was playing a video game, looking tired and speaking slowly. He asked where he'd been, and Julian said around. He asked for the money, reminding him he was leaving soon. Julian said there were problems, but if he came with him to someone's place, he could get it. He asked who the guy was. Julian delayed, destroying a row of aliens, then said it was someone he knew who would give him the money. He suggested Julian get it and bring it to him. Julian stared at him, left the arcade, and came back saying if he wanted the money, he had to come now. He said he really didn't want to. Julian said he'd see him later. He called him back. Julian demanded to know if he wanted the money or not. He asked why it had to be done this way. Julian just said because. He asked if there was another way. A pause. He asked again if he wanted the money. He said yes. Julian said they should go. They left the arcade. Finn's apartment was on Wilshire, not far from Rip's penthouse. Julian said he'd known Finn for 6 or 7 months, but the look on his face suggested it had been longer too long. The parking attendant recognized Julian's car and let him park in a loading zone. Julian waved at the doorman. They took the elevator, and Julian pressed the button for the penthouse, singing an old song loudly. He leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath as the elevator stopped. He caught his reflection hair cut too short, deep tan, sunglasses still on. They walked through the dark hallway to Finn's door, and Julian rang the bell. A boy of about 15 answered, bleached blonde tan, with a hardened look of a surfer, wearing only gray shorts. He recognized the kid as the one who'd been leaving Rip's apartment the day Rip stood him up. The boy stared at them with open hostility as they entered. He wondered if this was Finn, or if Finn was sleeping with the surfer, and the thought made his stomach tighten. Julian led the way to Finn's office, white door opening into a spare white room with floor-to-ceiling windows and mirrors on the ceiling. A wave of vertigo hit him, and he nearly lost his balance. Through the window, he could see his father's penthouse in Century City, and paranoia crept in, making him wonder if his father could see him. Finn sat behind a large desk, maybe 25 or 30, blonde and tan, unremarkable. The desk was bare except for a phone, an envelope, 2 silver vials, and a glass paperweight with a small fish trapped inside, its eyes wide as if begging. He found himself wondering if the fish was already dead, and if that even mattered. Finn smiled and asked who he was. Julian introduced him, distracted. Finn looked him over and turned his attention back to Julian, asking how the previous night had gone. Julian said fine, but Finn pressed, saying a client had called and praised him highly. Julian seemed surprised. He felt weak, paced the room, searched for a cigarette. Julian coughed. Finn told him he had an appointment at 4 at the St. Marquis with an out-of-town business client, then a party that night. Finn looked at him, tapping his fingers, and suggested that Julian bringing him along might be useful. The client wanted 2 guys, one just to watch, but someone else wasn't available. He looked at Julian, then Finn. Julian objected, saying he was just a friend, that he owed him money. He said he could wait, but a rush of adrenaline told him it was already too late. Finn insisted they both go. Julian refused, not wanting to drag anyone else in. Finn's tone hardened, enunciating each word, repeating that they should go at 4. Finn asked if he wanted his money. He shook his head. No, then corrected himself, saying yes, sure. Finn asked if he was all right. He said he was just shaky. Finn offered a sedative. He declined, looking back at the fish. Finn asked Julian about his parents. Julian said he didn't know. Finn proposed a plan: they'd go to the hotel, meet him at a club later, then go to a party where he'd get them their money. Julian asked where to meet him. Finn said upstairs at the club, asking if something was wrong. Julian said no, and they agreed on 9:30. He looked at Julian, and a memory of them in 5th grade flashed through his mind. Finn noticed Julian's distress, asked if he was okay. Julian said he was just nervous, his voice trailing off. Finn put an arm around him, offering comfort. Julian seemed to be crying. Finn politely asked him to excuse them. He stepped out, closing the door, but he could still hear their voices. Julian said he thought tonight would be his last, that he couldn't do it anymore, that he was sick of being sad. Finn soothed him. He knew he could leave, call someone, but he stayed. Julian resisted something Finn offered, saying he was through with it. A long silence followed, punctuated by the sound of matches and something slapping. Finn finally spoke, calling Julian his best boy, saying he cared for him like a son. Then he noted that Julian looked thin. The surfer brushed past him and entered the room, saying someone named Manuel was on the phone. Julian stood, buttoning his sleeve, and said goodbye. Finn told him to keep up his physique and winked. Finn addressed him too, saying he'd see him later tonight. He wanted to say no, but something told him he'd be there, and he nodded, trying to sound convincing. Finn called them terrific. He followed Julian across the hallway. In the living room, the surfer lay on the floor, hand down his pants, eating cereal, alternating between reading the box and watching a television show. The host's voice announced they'd entered another dimension. It felt so surreal that he knew it was true. He stared at the boy one last time, then followed Julian out into the dark hall. In the elevator, he asked why Julian hadn't told him the money was for this. Julian, glassy-eyed with a sad grin, asked, "Who cared, did he?" He realized he didn't, felt foolish, stupid. He also realized he would go with Julian to the St. Marquis. He wanted to see if things like this could actually happen. As the elevator descended, he understood the money didn't matter. Only seeing the worst did. The St. Marquis, 4 o'clock. Sunset Boulevard. The sun blazed like an orange monster as Julian pulled into the parking lot, passing the hotel twice. He kept asking why, and Julian kept asking if he really wanted to go through with it. He said he did. Stepping out, he looked at the pool and wondered if anyone had drowned in it. The hotel was hollow, a pool in a courtyard surrounded by rooms. A fat man in a lounge chair, oiled and shining, watched them approach room 001. Julian knocked. Curtains parted. A shadow peered out. A man in his 40s opened the door, wearing slacks, a shirt, and a tie. He asked what he could do for them. Julian asked if he was Mr. Erickson. The man confirmed and seemed to recognize them, his voice trailing off. Julian asked if something was wrong. The man said no and invited them in. He followed, unnerved by the hotel room. His great-grandfather had died in one, undiscovered for 2 days. The man offered them drinks. He wanted one badly but followed Julian's lead, declining. The man in the hotel room told them to make themselves comfortable, to sit. Julian asked for permission to remove his jacket, and the man, with a paternal ease, granted it, moving to fix himself a drink at the small bar. Julian tried to make conversation, asking about the man's business trip. The man answered that he was there for a week on business, a real estate man. Clay watched the exchange, a cold thread of paranoia weaving through his mind. He kept wondering if this stranger, this man from somewhere else, knew his father, if he might be the kind of man who would approach his father at lunch. The thought stuck, refusing to be shaken off. A silence settled over them, and the man's gaze moved between them, finally settling on Julian. He suggested Julian stand, then asked him to take off his tie, which Julian did without a word. Then he told him to take off his shoes and socks, and then the rest. Julian obeyed, slipping out of his shirt and pants, and the man looked over at Clay, making sure he was watching. The man walked over to Julian and put a hand on his bare shoulder. He told him he was a nice young man. A brief, vivid image of Julian as a boy, playing soccer on a green field, flickered through Clay's mind. But then the man in the room pulled him back, saying that Julian was a beautiful boy, and that was all that mattered here. Julian opened his eyes and looked at him. Clay turned away, his gaze falling on a fly on the wall. He considered leaving, trying to find the words to say he wanted to go, but they wouldn't form. He sat frozen in place, aware of a grim curiosity rising in him, a need to see just how bad it could get. The man went into the bathroom, and Clay got up, his hands shaking. He went to the bar, saw the man's wallet and picked it up, his nerves overriding any sense of why he was doing it. He saw credit cards, a wad of cash, and a stack of business cards he deliberately didn't look at, afraid of seeing his father's name. But he did see pictures of a tired woman and 2 confident blonde sons. He put the wallet back down, found Julian sitting on the bed with his head down, and sat again, turning on the stereo for something to fill the air. The man returned immediately, turned it off, and told him he wanted him to hear everything. Julian took off his underwear, and Clay asked to use the bathroom. The man smiled and said yes. Inside, Clay locked the door, ran the water, and flushed the toilet, trying to make himself sick, but he couldn't. He wiped his mouth and walked back into the room to find the man smiling, his face caught in the lengthening shadows of the late afternoon sun. Julian tried to smile back. Clay lit a cigarette. The man rolled Julian over. He kept his eyes open. 5 hours later at 9 o'clock they were finally walking out to the parking lot. Clay asked where they were going, and Julian told him they were going to get his money from a club on Hollywood Boulevard. He asked if Clay still wanted it, and Clay looked at him, feeling how old and worn Julian suddenly seemed. The memory of sitting in his Porsche before school smoking joints came to him, but it felt distant and meaningless now. They arrived at the club, and Julian pushed through the line, ignoring the kids' protests. They passed a manager who let them in, and a girl who snarled at them from the queue, and Julian flipped her off. Inside, it was dark and packed, the music loud. The crowd was listless. Clay's eyes adjusted to the dark as they moved through the crowd and up a back stairway to the DJ's booth. There they found Finn on a couch, talking to a nervous tan boy named Lee. Finn introduced them, and Julian tersely said the job was done and he wanted the money. Finn deflected it, saying they'd get paid at another party, after Julian performed one last favor. Lee was 18 but looked younger, and the sight of him unnerved Clay. Finn talked up Lee's preppy look, saying it was just what certain people wanted, promising easy money, that the clients were just studio executives. Julian muttered a protest, but Finn silenced him, and Clay just watched Lee smile, feeling a strange, sick kinship with his innocent, clueless expression. They all piled into cars, Julian telling Finn he had to drop Clay off to get his own car. Clay drove himself, following them into the hills. The house in Bel Air was a vast stone fortress, its sprawling lawn decorated with Spanish fountains and stone gargoyles leering from the roofline. After the valet took his car, Clay followed Julian and Finn and the new boy Lee through the open front door. Inside, the crowd was a mix of mostly men, some women, and everyone seemed to know Finn. A few even recognized Julian. In the living room, a strobe light was flashing, and the strobing effect combined with a loud rhythmic music to create a dizzying, disorienting sensation. For a moment Clay felt his knees buckle, and the room seemed to tilt. He pushed through a haze of staring eyes and chatter. A man approached Finn, greeting him warmly and asking about business. Finn introduced Julian and Lee as his best boys, and Lee smiled shyly. When Finn nudged Julian to engage, Julian's response was terse. Finn then suggested they all dance, but Julian refused, saying he needed a moment and broke away. Clay tried to follow him through the crowd but lost sight of him. Left alone, Clay lit a cigarette and searched for a bathroom, finding one locked. Leaning against a wall, he felt a cold sweat break out, the Clash's music pulsing around him. A young man he vaguely recognized stared at him from across the room, but Clay realized the guy was too stoned to actually see him. Finally, a man and woman emerged from the bathroom, laughing, and Clay slipped inside. He locked the door and took out a small vial, using the last of the cocaine it contained. He drank from the faucet, then studied his reflection in the mirror, running a hand over his hair and cheek, noticing he needed a shave. Suddenly the door burst open and Julian was shoved inside, followed by Finn. Finn slammed Julian against the wall and locked the door behind them. An argument erupted. Julian yelled that he was leaving, and demanded Finn pay Clay. But Finn accused him of acting like an asshole, and warned him not to ruin the evening for his important clients. Julian pleaded to be left alone, but Finn kept pressing, asking him what he would do, who he would run to. He called Julian pathetic. The shouting escalated, Julian screaming for him to stop, and Finn, his voice taking on a cold edge, said that Julian had come to him a year ago with a debt, and that he'd given him a job, clothes, and all the cocaine he could want. He demanded to know what Julian had done in return. Julian accused him of turning him into a whore. Finn told him, quietly, that he hadn't done that Julian had done it to himself. The accusation hung in the air as Julian broke down, apologizing, saying he couldn't do it anymore. But Finn said he couldn't let him go that easily. Julian slid to the floor, and Clay watched, frozen, as Finn took out a syringe and a spoon. Julian tried to laugh, insisting he was leaving, that his debt was paid. But Finn ignored him, squatting down and tying a belt around Julian's arm to find a vein. As he heated something in the spoon, Julian weakly protested, but the needle went in. Finn told him he had nowhere to go, and that no one would believe the story of how he'd hoard himself out to pay his debt. A moment passed. A strange memory people are afraid to merge flickering through Clay's mind as Finn led Julian out of the bathroom. Clay followed, watching Finn guide Julian up the long staircase to a door that was open just a crack. Low moans came from inside, and then a scream as they entered, and the door slammed shut. Clay turned and left the house. He drove to the Roxy where a band called X was playing. It was almost midnight and the club was crowded. He found Trent near the entrance, who asked where he'd been. Clay didn't answer, just took the drink Trent offered and pressed the cool glass against his face. Trent said Rip was there, and he led Clay over to him. As they walked, Trent mentioned the band was about to play a particular song, and Clay gave a dull, automatic response. Rip and his friend Spin were there, and the conversation turned instantly hostile. Rip complained about the number of Mexican people in the crowd, and Spin laughed, agreeing. Trent laughed along with them. Rip, noticing how bad Clay looked, offered him some cocaine, but Clay refused and finished Trent's drink. A young man bumped into him, and Rip shoved him away, shouting an ethnic slur. He then turned his attention to Spin, who was talking to a guy named Ross. Ross was telling them about a discovery he'd made: a body in an alley. Rip was immediately interested, excited, and urged Clay to come see. Clay refused, saying he wanted to stay for the show. Rip then insisted he come, claiming he wanted to show Clay something at his own place afterward. They followed Rip and Spin to Rip's car, then drove separately to the back of a closed store on Melrose where Ross was waiting. In the deserted lot, Ross led them into the dark alley. He muttered that he hoped no one had called the police, and Rip asked who else knew about it. Ross said some friends had found him that afternoon. Two girls emerged from the darkness, giggling, and one asked who the guy was. Ross didn't know. They wondered what happened to him: an overdose, Ross guessed. One asked if they'd called the police, but Ross seemed to think that was pointless. They mentioned going to see X at the Roxy. When Ross asked about someone named Mimi, they said she'd been there with Durf but had left. They talked about the band for a moment, lamenting they didn't play a particular song, then wandered off. The group followed Ross deeper into the alley. There, propped against the back wall, illuminated by a single bulb, was the body of a young man, perhaps 18 or 19. His face was bloated and pale, his eyes closed, his mouth open, with dried blood crusted above his lip. Rip pushed at the body with his foot, asking if he was definitely dead. Ross giggled. Spin knelt down to study the face, and Trent laughed, lighting a joint. Clay couldn't look away from the dead boy, his hands shaking too badly to light his own cigarette. Moths swirled around the bulb above them. Trent noticed the boy had no socks. They stood there as a wind moved through the alley. Spin suddenly thought he recognized the body, but Rip dismissed it. Trent offered Clay the joint, and he took a drag before handing it back. Ross suggested they leave, but Rip insisted they stay, sticking a cigarette in the dead boy's mouth. They waited 5 more minutes. Then Spin stood up, saying he needed a cigarette. Rip took Clay's arm and insisted he and Trent had to come back to his place. He had something that would blow their minds. Trent was eager, and they all left the alley. At Rip's apartment on Wilshire, he led them straight into the bedroom. A young, pretty girl lay naked on the mattress, her legs spread and tied to the bedposts, her arms tied above her head. Her skin was rashed where it had been shaved. She moaned and muttered, moving her head, her eyes half closed, her lips clumsily coated in makeup. Spin knelt, picked up a syringe, and whispered to her, then injected her. Trent was impressed. Rip said she was 12, and Spin laughed, calling her tight. Clay asked who she was. Rip said her name was Chandra. While Ross played a video game in the living room, Spin put on music and began undressing, then forced himself at the girl's mouth, inviting the others to watch. Clay left the room. Rip followed, and Clay asked him why. Rip seemed genuinely confused, asking why not. Clay protested that the girl was 11. Rip corrected him: 12. Clay repeated it, feeling the weight of the number. Rip told him not to look at him like he was a scumbag. Clay tried to speak, but his words faltered. Rip pushed him, asking what he was trying to say, demanding an answer. Clay struggled to articulate his revulsion, managing only that it didn't seem right. Rip countered with a blunt philosophy that wanting something gave you the right to take it. Leaning against the wall, Clay could hear the sounds from the bedroom, the moaning and a sharp slap. He told Rip that he already had everything, that he didn't need this. Rip denied it. When Clay pressed him on what he was missing, Rip gave a quiet answer: he had nothing left to lose. Rip turned and walked back into the bedroom. Clay looked in and saw Trent already unbuttoning his shirt, watching Spin, who was straddling the girl's head. Clay called to Trent, urging him to leave. Trent glanced at the scene and then back at Clay, deciding to stay. Spin, without pausing, told him to shut the door if he was staying. Trent repeated the suggestion, and Clay closed the door, walked through the living room where Ross was absorbed in his video game. Ross called out that he'd gotten the high score, asking where Clay was going. Clay didn't answer. Ross speculated he was going back to check on the body again. Clay left the apartment and drove toward the desert, a memory surfacing of a house near Rancho Mirage that belonged to a friend of his cousin's. The boy was good-looking, and from a wealthy family, bound for Stanford, and he'd host weekend parties at the desert house. Kids from all over California would come. One night near the end of summer, a party spiraled out of control. The next morning, a girl from San Diego was found at a drive-in, tied and mutilated, her body hanging from a swing set. The boy disappeared, some said to Mexico, others to Canada or London. His mother was institutionalized, and the house stood empty for 2 years until it burned down one night, rumored to have been set by the boy who'd returned. Now Clay drove up the canyon road where that house once stood, still wearing the same clothes from the afternoon sequence of horrors. He parked and sat, smoking, scanning the shadows and listening for any sound that might suggest a presence. He knew the stories of people seeing the boy wandering the ruins at night. Other stories said the police had caught him and committed him to a hospital far from the Stanford campus he'd been destined for. He drove away from the ruins, pushing further out into the desert, the warm night air recalling other desert nights from his childhood, his parents playing bridge with friends, his sisters watching television, the hot wind blowing through his hair as he drove his father's car. He remembered those mornings when he'd be the first up, watching steam rise off the heated pool at dawn, the stillness so absolute he could see the shadows of the sun move across the pool's bottom, his mother's dark back tanning throughout the day. In the week before he left, his sister's small brown kitten disappeared. She'd heard squealing and a yelp in the night, and the next morning there were tufts of matted fur and dried blood near the door. He knew the danger of coyotes in the hills on some clear moonlit nights. He'd seen their shapes moving through the streets. Late at night on Mulholland, he'd sometimes have to swerve to avoid them running through the fog, red rags in their mouths. Only later would he realize the red rags were cats. It was just something you lived with, if you lived in the hills. On a bathroom wall at a club called Page's, he'd seen graffiti that started with a claim about Julian and ended with a raw, furious curse directed at parents, full of accusations of abandonment and hatred. He spent the final week mostly in his room, listening obsessively to a confusing song by a local composer about a man on his knees. When someone told him the song was about being grateful to be in the city, Clay disagreed, but the person insisted he was missing the point. He also watched an afternoon television show that played music videos to a crowd of teenagers dancing in front of a huge screen. He recognized people he'd seen at clubs, their faces upturned to the massive glowing images. Some mouthed the words to the songs. He found himself drawn to those who didn't, who had forgotten them, or perhaps had never known them. One afternoon, driving with Rip on Mulholland, they stopped at a particularly treacherous curve. Rip pointed down at the wrecked cars littering the ravine below, some rusted and burnt, others fresh and crushed, their colors lurid in the sunlight. He spoke of friends who'd died there, who'd made a mistake in the night and sailed off into nothingness. On quiet nights, Rip said, you could hear the screech of tires, a silence, a whoosh, and then an impact. Sometimes, if you listened very closely, there were brief screams. He doubted the cars would ever be removed. They'd just fill the ravine and bury it as an example. Standing there, looking over the valley under a burning sun, Clay believed him. Later, as they drove, Rip turned onto a road that Clay was certain was a dead end. When Clay asked where they were going, Rip said he didn't know, just driving. Clay pointed out that the road went nowhere. Rip replied that it didn't matter. Asked what did matter, Rip answered simply that they were on it. Before he left, the city seemed to be unraveling in a series of grim news items. A woman's throat slit in Venice, arson fires in Chatsworth, a man in Encino who killed his family, a fatal car accident on Pacific Coast Highway that claimed 4 teenagers. Muriel was back in the hospital. A fraternity boy nicknamed Conan had killed himself at UCLA. At the Beverly Center, he ran into Alana, who admitted she'd been keeping a low profile. He mentioned meeting someone named Evan Dixon, and Alana revealed she was dating him. When Clay pressed, she added that Evan was also sleeping with a guy named Durf. Clay could only muster a flat response. He asked if it bothered her. She dismissed it as typical. When she asked if he'd had a good time during his visit, he told her no. She offered a hollow, sympathetic response. One afternoon at a market, taking his sisters for a ride, he spotted Finn with Jared in the frozen foods aisle. Finn noticed him too, and when Clay moved to the vegetables, Finn followed. Clay grabbed a six-pack and cigarettes, and Finn grinned at him from the checkout, exchanging a casual greeting before cocking his fingers like a gun. At a store called Parachute, he watched Trent try on clothes while a pretty blonde boy, probably Evan, stood in the middle of the floor, modeling outfits in his underwear, examining himself in a mirror. His boyfriend came up behind him and broke his trance. Trent mentioned he'd seen the same boy with Julian, parked outside a high school, talking to a 14-year-old, and even through Julian's sunglasses, the bruises around his eyes had been visible. Reading the paper by the pool at twilight, Clay found a story about a man who'd tried to bury himself alive in his backyard because of the unbearable heat. His sisters, still in their bikinis, played a game where they pretended to be dead, competing to see who could look most lifeless, the winner earning the right to push the other into the pool. He listened to a tape on his Walkman, a song about getting worlds away, and when he opened his eyes, his sisters were floating face down in the water, seeing who could look the most drowned. At an almost empty Westwood theater, he saw an old friend but said nothing, relieved when the lights went down. In the arcade afterward, Trent played a game with cartoon hot dogs and eggs chasing a chef. When Trent tried to teach him, Clay found himself staring at the frantic wiggling food on the screen until he couldn't take it anymore. He wandered to other machines, but they all seemed to feature bugs and spiders and drowning frogs, their frantic music giving him a headache. Driving home, Trent told him he'd acted like a jerk. On Beverly Glen, he saw a red Jaguar with a license plate that read "Decline" and had to pull over. When Trent pressed him on what was wrong, he blamed a headache and promised to call from New Hampshire. A flashback came to him a Sunday night in August, standing in a doorless phone booth at a gas station in Palm Desert, waiting for a call from Blair. She was leaving for New York the next day. A bus stop was nearby, a few people waiting under fluorescent lights. A teenage boy he suspected was hitchhiking boarded a bus. Ants marched across an empty yogurt cup where he'd stubbed out a cigarette. 3 phone booths at the station were all occupied. A young surfer in the next booth hung up without dropping a dime. Clay pretended not to notice. A car with a personalized plate Gab's toy pulled up, its occupants getting out to the sound of an old song. The phone finally rang. It was Blair. He told her not to go. She asked where he was. He said Palm Desert. She asked why. He said why not. He urged her to come to Palm Springs with him instead. She accused him of hurting her, reminding him of promises he'd broken, that he'd said he was never going back east. He apologized, said things would be okay, but she'd heard it before. If they really liked each other, 4 months shouldn't matter. He asked if she remembered a certain night at Disneyland, but she didn't recall it. They hung up. He drove back to Los Angeles, went to a movie alone, drove aimlessly until early morning, then sat in a restaurant until it closed. At home, Blair called again. He told her he'd miss her, and that maybe things would work out when he got back. She said maybe, and then added that she did remember that night at Disneyland after all. He left for New Hampshire the next week and didn't speak to her for 4 months. Before leaving, he met Blair for lunch at a restaurant on Sunset. She was already there, seated on the terrace, sipping wine in her sunglasses. He watched her turn her face to the breeze for a moment and felt a flash of envy at her apparent composure. He came up behind her, kissed her cheek, and sat down. She smelled like wine and perfume. As he leafed through the menu and watched the traffic pass, he began to feel that being there was a mistake. She expressed surprise that he'd shown up. He reminded her he'd said he would. She asked where he'd been, and he mentioned lunch with his father. She made a bland comment about it. He lit a cigarette, feeling defensive. When she asked what else he'd been doing, he challenged her. She diffused it, saying she just wanted to talk. He told her to go ahead. She pressed him about his weekend, but he couldn't remember anything, telling her it was nothing. He picked up the menu again and put it down. She noted he was actually going back to school. He said there was nothing left in L.A. She asked if he'd expected to find anything. He admitted he didn't know, that he'd been there a long time. He kicked his foot against the railing, trying to ignore her, the whole situation feeling wrong. Then she asked him outright if he'd ever loved her. He pretended not to hear, his gaze fixed on a billboard. She repeated the question. The sun hit his eyes, and for a moment he saw himself with sudden clarity. A memory of the first time they'd been together flashed through his mind. He asked her not to do this, but she insisted on an answer, a simple yes or no. He evaded, asking why she needed to know. She sighed in frustration. He gave a weak, evasive answer, and she accused him of lying. He snapped, demanding to know what she wanted to hear. His voice rose. He'd never loved her. The words came out with a strange, almost reflexive laughter. She thanked him and sipped her wine, saying that was all she'd needed to know. He asked the same question back, with a hollow curiosity. She paused, admitting she had loved him once, that things had been good, that he'd been kind. But then the confession turned. It was as if he wasn't really there. She felt that other people, even if they failed, at least made an effort. He never had. She'd pitied him for a while, but found it hard to sustain. He was a beautiful boy, but that was all he was. It was hard to feel sorry for someone who didn't care. He asked what she meant. She challenged him. What did he care about? What made him happy? He told her bluntly that nothing did, that he liked nothing. She asked if he'd ever cared about her. He said he didn't want to care, it would only create more to worry about, more pain. She told him she'd cared about him for a little while. She then said she had to go, and he suddenly didn't want her to leave, feeling a desperate urge to keep her there. She said she had another lunch appointment. He asked what would become of them, but she returned the question and waited. He stared at the billboard until it blurred, and when his vision cleared, he saw her car disappear into the traffic. That night, she called. She asked him not to go. He tried to reassure her, saying he'd only be away a few months. She said it was a long time. He mentioned summer. She insisted it was too long. He promised he'd be back. She said she didn't believe him. He told her she had to. She accused him of lying. He said he wasn't. Before leaving, he read a magazine article about a street in Hollywood where drivers reported seeing apparitions, Indians on horseback, a tomahawk thrown through a window, a covered wagon that made a man crash into a palm tree. His room was stripped down to the essentials: books, television, stereo, a mattress, a poster of Elvis Costello, and a shoebox of old pictures. A torn poster of California hung unevenly on his wall. Late one night, he drove to Topanga Canyon and parked near an abandoned carnival. In the silence, he heard the wind, the creak of a Ferris wheel, a coyote's howl, and the flap of tents. It was time to go back. He'd been home a long time. A song he'd heard in L.A. stayed with him. Its lyrics were harsh, full of images of madness and desperation. He'd learned they were personal to the songwriter, and no one he knew shared them. But the images that stuck with him were of people driven insane by the city, of parents so hungry they ate their children, of teenagers blinded by the sun. Those violent, malicious images lingered long after he left, becoming his only frame of reference for a long time. The end. Thank you for staying with this story until its final moments. Some novels end with answers. Others leave behind a feeling that's harder to escape, and Less Than Zero has always belonged to that second kind. What makes its final pages so unsettling is how little they ask of the reader. There are no dramatic speeches, no clear moral judgment, only a quiet realization that emotional numbness can become its own prison. The people in this world are rarely searching for happiness. They're searching for something, anything that makes them feel alive. That lingering emptiness is what has kept readers returning to the novel for decades. When the story reached the screen in 1987, director Mara Kanievska chose a very different emotional path. Screenwriter Harley Peyton reshaped the narrative into something more traditionally dramatic, giving the characters clearer emotional arcs and a stronger sense of redemption. For many viewers, it worked as a powerful standalone film, while longtime readers often felt the novel's haunting ambiguity had been softened. Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal of Julian remains one of the film's most memorable performances, bringing heartbreaking vulnerability to the role. Andrew McCarthy's Clay and Jamie Gertz's Blair grounded the emotional core of the adaptation, while James Spader's unsettling performance as Rip added an unforgettable sense of menace. Behind the camera, cinematographer Edward Lachman contrasted the beauty of sunlit Los Angeles with the character's emotional isolation, and Thomas Newman's atmospheric score quietly amplified that sense of loneliness without ever overwhelming it. One of the film's most enduring strengths became its soundtrack, capturing the mood of late 1980s Los Angeles as vividly as its images. It's also interesting that many people discover the movie first, only to be surprised by how much darker, quieter, and more emotionally detached the original novel truly is. Rather than replacing one another, the book and the film almost feel like two different interpretations of the same nightmare. If this retelling moved you, the original novel is well worth experiencing in its own voice. Its minimalist style creates an atmosphere that no adaptation or retelling can completely recreate, and many of its most powerful moments exist in what is left unsaid. If you found yourself connecting with this story, I'd love to hear what stayed with you most, or whether you interpreted its ending differently. If you'd like to join me for more journeys through unforgettable books, your support by liking, subscribing, and sharing helps keep these stories alive for others to discover. Until the next story, remember that the most haunting endings are rarely the loudest. They're the quiet ones that follow you into ordinary moments, reminding you that sometimes the greatest distance isn't between two places. It's between who we appear to be and who we truly are.